She had everything going for her. The looks, the money, the car, the house, ambitions. She had it all.
Success is often measured by the joy and love one gives and receives.
She has made a difference on the world with her kindness.
But when someone else tries to measure up,
I can see how it leads to a perfect storm.
Being rejected, add to that jealousy and the envy.
admiration turns into resentment.
It took over in a way that was really toxic.
You're lying. If you're recovering from someone or recovering from your own self.
And an idolization ends in disaster.
This wasn't just about wanting to be with Linnell. It was about wanting to be Linnell.
That interest sounds more than admiration. It sounds like obsession.
Linnell's personality was strong, and she knew like what she wanted, you know, she was deliberate. She was helpful, understanding, forgiving.
Do you think that Linnell may have been too trusting?
I believe that Linnell did not know or have any idea of even any kind of obsession. Like, how do you find out that somebody's obsessed other than that they keep calling you or bugging you? She probably was lied to from the beginning, and that would probably be the only mistake that I say that Linnell did, was trusting this person.
Growing up in South Central Los Angeles in the 80s, Linnell Crystal Barsock was always a light to those around her.
I was actually really good friends with her family members. We got a lot of hugs. The matriarchs, the aunts and the grandmas and stuff, they were very disciplinary, like, you know, ladylike, be ladies, but at the same time, it was always just love. If I were to describe her in school, I would say shy, not shy like I don't want to talk, but more like reserved. And I knew she did good grades. I knew her family, so I knew she was going to do good in school. That was a given.
As Linnell moved through her teenage years, she stayed focused on her future.
Linnell graduated high school in 1998, and then right after that, she pursued a nursing program. She was an ambitious person who wanted to better her life.
With Linnell, I knew that she would do something along the lines of helping people.
One day, she is on campus, she is leaving her nursing classes, and she sees a guy. And they get to talking, and this guy is a Haitian immigrant named Louis Bounier, and they hit it off almost immediately. They enjoyed each other's company, and a lot of people thought that they were a really cute couple.
Linnell graduated from nursing school and really decided to focus in on setting up her life. She got a job at a psychiatric hospital and supplemented her income doing nursing jobs.
Lewis was also focused on achieving. He was working for the city of Hawthorne. He was working maintenance and cleaning the streets as well. In 2009, the two of them are really putting their plans into action. They decide that they are going to buy a home. This beautiful, huge home in Palmdale, California, 3,800 square feet.
She bought a big house like that because she was planning to establish a living care facility for patients, elderly patients that need 24-hour care.
Louis was very supportive of her vision. So to her, that really meant a lot, to find someone that was, you know, very supportive of whatever goals she had.
We all knew that it was more affordable to live outside of Los Angeles. I think that she just made the conscious decision to understand the plan, 10 years, 20 years, and for her to put her roots down in Palmdale.
Linnell's dreams match her big heart, and they attract the attention of everyone around her.
A year later, in the spring of 2010, things were really lining up. Linnell's family really thought, like, soon Lewis is gonna pop the question. We're about to make this official.
You have plans, and then something happens and it's taken away. Nobody has a right to do that.
Just after 7 p.m., Palmdale police are suddenly notified about a crime.
A female ran into the sheriff's station in the city of Palmdale, hysterical, and she had blood on her.
This woman was identified as Lorraine Austin, and she reported that her best friend, Linnell Barsock, had just been murdered, and she found her because she slipped in blood in the garage at Linnell's house.
They actually put Lorraine Austin into a patrol car and drove out there with her so she could point out the house. So once the deputies got there, they set up a perimeter. They went inside to clear the house, and they did find Linnell Barsock.
They discovered Linnell deceased on the passenger side of her BMW, lying on the floor in a pool of blood with a trash bag covering her head.
She had the plastic bag around her head, but the portion in the front had been lifted up to expose her face. So once they cleared the house, they set up the crime scene tape around it, and they called us.
Detective Espino and his partner arrive at the crime scene around 11 p.m.
We talked to the deputies that were on the scene, and they gave us a quick briefing as to what had occurred. When we stepped in the garage, there was bloody linen, bloody plastic sheets. The victim was laying on her back by the right rear quarter panel of the car.
The detectives removed the plastic bag and find a gunshot wound to the back of her head.
She had been dragged into the garage. You can tell by the blood marks leading from the garage door that leads into the house.
It appeared as if they were going to place Linnell's body in the car. And it appears as if the killer possibly was interrupted before they were able to do so.
Once the search warrant was signed, we went inside the house. In the family room, we found blood spatter against that east wall where the television is located. In addition to that, we noticed there was a void in the carpet.
There is a rectangular shape on the carpet that is the shape of an area rug, but the area rug is not on the carpet, leading them to believe that it's been removed.
They continue to look through the house, and they find a spent 9mm shell casing. So at least they know what type of weapon they're looking for. Every single detail. And then they go back into the garage.
The area rug that belonged to the family room had been folded and placed into the back seat of the victim's car. In the trunk of the car, we found a pillow, and that pillow was a throw pillow. It had a bullet hole in it, and that's indicative of someone putting a gun to the back of that pillow and firing through the pillow.
They determined that Linnell's killer probably came up to Linnell from behind, put a pillow to the back of her head, and shot the gun against the pillow, ending her life immediately.
There were no signs of forced entry. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was premeditated and planned, and it had to be someone that was familiar with our victim because this was specific towards our victim. She was the target of this murder.
Los Angeles County detectives are investigating the brutal murder of 29-year-old Linnell Barsock after she was found shot in her home.
As the detectives are trying to put together a motive, they find something in the kitchen
we found on the floor next to the refrigerator a Dear John letter.
The letter read, "Dear Lewis, I'm leaving you for another man named Ike." In this letter, she says that Ike makes more money than Lewis, and Ike paid her car note, and she and Ike have plans to go get married, so whatever they had is over.
But Lewis is nowhere to be found, leading investigators to believe he might be on the run.
To us, that was the motivation behind the murder. He went off the deep end and murdered her because of that.
Investigators next question the key witness and the victim's friend, Lorraine Austin.
Lorraine was transported back to the sheriff's office.
Lorraine Austin tells police that ever since Linnell moved to Palmdale, Lorraine would visit her house 2 to 3 times a week, and she called her by her middle name, Crystal.
And how long have you known her? So you've known her for 10 years?
Yeah.
Lorraine Austin tells us that not only had they been friends for 10 years, went to high school together, but she would spend nights at Linnell Barsock's house all the time, sleepovers.
Lorraine knew all of her deepest, darkest secrets. And Lorraine indicated to police that Linnell had started dating Ike, who was a medical helicopter flight nurse.
How long has she been dating Ike on the side?
Probably like 3-4 months or something like that.
He lived in Lancaster, which is a city adjacent to Palmdale. He would come down and visit Linnell during his time off.
Lewis began to suspect that Linnell was cheating on him.
He was always wondering, "Linnell, who are you always on the phone with who is taking up all of your time?"
She said that Lewis was a very jealous and possessive man of Linnell Barsock. He stalked her. He would get a hold of Linnell's phone and look through her call history.
Lorraine says the day before the murder, she visited the couple's home to do Linnell's hair.
She says, I go over there, I braid down her hair, but while I'm braiding her hair, her and her boyfriend Lewis, they start getting into an argument.
She said Linnell had obtained a second cell phone so she could solely communicate with Ike.
That particular day, the phone ran out of minutes, so Linnell could not communicate with Ike. So Ike started calling the house on the landline, and he kept calling and calling.
Ike is calling the house phone. And if he's calling the house phone, Lewis is upset.
Basically found out about it because he kept saying, "Who is this person you're talking to?"
She says that there was a big heated argument between Linnell and Lewis, at which time Linnell admitted to Lewis that yes, she was having an affair with Ike. And they got so heated that at some point, Lewis got scratched by Linnell on the side of his face. Linnell started crying and said, "Look, I'll break up with Ike and I'm gonna cut off this phone."
Lorraine told police she felt uncomfortable, so she left at that time.
So, as promised, Lorraine comes back the very next day. But according to Lorraine, she comes in and they're arguing again, and they just can't get it together. She leaves and she goes to the park to walk around.
What time was that when you left to go to the park?
I left out of there like at 1:20, 1:25. I was trying to hurry up and get out.
Was there anybody else there besides the two of them?
No.
Okay.
While she's walking around the park, she gets a phone call from her boyfriend, Ciego, and she's talking to him, kind of telling him what's going on at the house.
He called me at 4, and I was sitting there talking to him for a minute. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna start walking back.
She said she came back to the house to finish Linnell's hair. And she said when she got to the front door, she called out Linnell's name, and she didn't get a response.
She walked past the kitchen and noticed the mop and continued on to the garage. Once Lorraine entered the garage, she slipped on 2 sheets on the floor and fell down.
She said that she stood up and then she looked around and she saw what she thought was blood. And then she wiped her hand on her foot and realized she had slipped on blood. She walked around, and then she saw some feet, and she recognized the toenail polish and said, "Oh my God, that's my friend, that's Linnell." We subsequently found out that Lorraine Austin, when she discovered the body, she actually exposed the face to confirm that that was her friend.
She sees this and she runs from the garage. She's terrified at this point and she's covered in blood trying to get out to her car. And then when she's headed out the door, she looks up the stairs and she sees Lewis.
He was just sitting there looking blank.
Looking blank.
And I'm like, oh my God.
She says, "I gotta get out of here or I'm gonna be next. I'm gonna get killed."
In an interview with LA County Sheriff's investigators, Lorraine Austin said moments after finding the body of her best friend, she came face to face with Linnell Barsock's suspected killer.
She walks past the staircase and she looks up, and who does she see at the top of the staircase? She sees Lewis, Linnell's living boyfriend. And Lewis is looking down at her and he looks angry.
And I'm like, oh my God, you know, and I'm pretty sure my expression, my eyes got big. I ran straight to the door.
He starts running down the staircase after her. She says she makes a beeline for the front door, opens the front door, runs out to her car, is able to reach into the purse, find the keys, get in the car, and she drives away. And she gets to the sheriff's station, she runs in, and she tells them what had happened.
Investigators believe that Lorraine is lucky to be alive.
She's very soft-spoken, kind of meek, kind of mild-mannered a little bit. When we spoke to her, she came across as a very, very believable and credible witness.
Even though they have no reason to believe that she's lying, the detectives still have to do their due diligence. They said, "We need your DNA and your fingerprints so that we can rule you out while we're collecting evidence and trying to rule people in." And she willingly gives up her DNA and her fingerprints.
Investigators double their efforts to track down Lewis and determine through license plate readers that his registered vehicle is still in the city of Los Angeles.
That pickup truck had been photographed twice, parked in front of a location in South Central Los Angeles. So we called the nearest sheriff's station, which was the South LA station, and sure enough, the deputies went out there and the truck was parked in front of that location.
They look at the address and find out that this is the address of Linnell's mother. Lewis, the potential suspect, is at the home of the mother of the victim.
We later found out on Thursdays when Lewis would go to work in the city of Hawthorne, rather than drive the hour and a half to 2.5 hours back to Palmdale at the end of the day, just to turn around and drive back the next day, he would spend the next 4 days at Bobby Barsock's house. So my partner called that number, and the lady that answered was Bobby Barsock, which is our victim's mother. We identified ourselves and told her we were doing an investigation, but we need to talk to Lewis.
They spoke to Lewis, and they shared that Linnell had suffered an injury, and they needed to speak to him at the sheriff's department. Lewis agrees. He steps out of the home, and he's immediately taken into custody.
The police informed Barbie Barsock that her daughter, Linnell Barsock, had been murdered.
Bobby Barsock got hysterical, as you would expect.
Learning about what happened to Linnell, it was a shock. For someone as loving as Linnell and caring, you would think, like, why would they want to do that to her? You know, she was really sweet.
Lewis is transported back to the sheriff's office, where investigators question him.
We asked him, "Well, where were you today?" And he's like, "Well, I went to Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, to get my car fixed."
According to Lewis, he and Linnell last spoke by phone at 2:30 p.m. on June 16th.
Tell me about your relationship with your girlfriend. You guys happy? Any problems?
I never had a problem with her.
No problems.
No problem.
We asked him, Lewis, we're hearing from Lorraine that there was arguing going on about a guy named Ike. What do you know about Ike?
Tell me what Ike is his friend.
Well, Lewis, where'd you get that scratch on the side of your face? I heard you guys got a nasty argument. And as a result of that argument, Linnell admitted that she was having an affair with this Ike, and she wound up scratching you. Why did you tell us there were no problems? Because those are problems.
It's not a problem.
The detectives don't feel like they're getting anywhere with Lewis, so they decide that they are going to put up their hand. And they say, Linnell is not just injured. She has been shot and killed.
He started crying and saying, you gotta help me find him, you gotta help me find who did this, why did this happen? But I didn't see any tears.
I don't come on tonight telling you, why are you shooting at? That's not me, that's not me. Why did you do that? Oh my God.
If it wasn't you, who could have done it?
That everyone shows emotion differently, but I thought he's faking it. I thought this guy's just putting on a show.
Investigators keep Lewis in custody while they look into his alibi.
The next thing that the detectives do is they talk to Bobby.
Bobby Barsaw confirmed everything that Lorraine had told us regarding Lewis being jealous, possessive, all that. She confirmed the relationship that Linnell had developed with Ike.
But the most disturbing detail about Lewis's alleged behavior comes from Linnell's brother.
Jerome Barsaw told us that he overlooked Lewis on the computer, and Lewis was researching flights to Miami and saw him making banking transactions. We thought all that speaks volumes. He is financing his escape, so it all just added fuel to the fire that all pointed to Lewis.
"24 hours into Linnell Barsaw's murder investigation, detectives are all but convinced their victim was killed by her estranged boyfriend, Louis Bonaire.
Everything pointed to him. And so not just the statements of Lorraine Austin, Bobby Barsaw, Lewis's own statements, but the physical evidence. We had the scratch, the Dear John letter.
With Lewis being arrested, Linnell's family is feeling at least some sort of relief that possibly her killer is in custody.
But Lewis insists he's innocent, and he has the receipts to prove he was in LA at the time of Linnell's death.
On the 22nd of June, we got the search warrant signed and we went to the truck and we started processing it. And I found the receipts.
Police were able to track Louise's movements throughout Los Angeles with the receipts from the different auto parts stores and the surveillance video, which showed him and Ciego, which was Lorraine's boyfriend, from 1:50 p.m. to 5:46 p.m.
On this same day, Lewis is making several phone calls, and the calls are pinging from a cell tower in South Central LA, and it never leaves the area.
They traced the cell phone towers and noted that he left Palmdale and entered South Central Los Angeles and never returned to Palmdale that evening.
At that time, we knew that Lewis was not our shooter. There's no way that he would have driven back to Palmdale and shot our victim, cleaned it up, and made it back.
The detectives are baffled. They really thought that they had their guy. And they're wondering, did Lorraine lie to us?
Lewis is ultimately cleared of all charges and released from jail. But investigators have one more suspect who might have a motive to kill Linnell. Her alleged lover, Ike.
We interviewed Ike, and he explained that he had met Linnell Barsaw on a website, and they hit it off, and they developed a relationship. He said it was his understanding that Linnell and Lewis were ex-boyfriend, girlfriend, only living together until they can resolve how they're gonna divvy up the house. So she was lying about her relationship with Lewis.
The detectives then asked the question, where were you at the time that Linnell got murdered? And Ike explains, well, on the 16th, I was at an interview in Sacramento from 3 to 4 p.m.
I actually spoke with the person that interviewed him, and they said he actually got to the interview a half hour early. So he was there at 2:30 in the afternoon. We know via the phone call that Linnell made to Lewis that she was still alive at 2:30.
Lorraine Austin reported discovering her friend's body at 7 p.m., narrowing the timeline even further.
The interview lasted till 4, and Sacramento is like 420 miles from Palmdale. It takes about 7 hours to drive from Sacramento to Palmdale. So there's no way he'd be able to get down here in time to drive. And if he caught a plane, it still would not give you time because the flight's a little over an hour and you've got to get to the airport at least an hour early, and then you got to get from LAX to Palmdale. There's just no way. It's physically impossible for him to have been involved in this.
Police eliminated Ike as a person of interest.
On July 14th, investigators bring Lorraine Austin back in for further questioning.
I can prove Lewis wasn't in the house when you said he was there.
So we confronted her on that. We went through the story, and she told us the exact same story she told us earlier.
I know what he looked like, and I know that day I saw him up there on the stairs.
Couldn't have.
But that's impossible.
It's impossible.
It is impossible.
Believe me, he wasn't there. He went anywhere near Palmdale. And he had been there for hours. Lewis was nowhere near you.
But Lorraine is sticking to her guns. Same story every single time.
We knew that was all a lie. She made that up, so why is she lying to us?
You're lying. You're covering for someone. You're covering for yourself. We are ramping things up because we are going to find the truth. Wherever the truth is, we're going to find it.
By July 2010, Los Angeles County Sheriff's investigators have eliminated Linnell Barsock's boyfriend and her alleged lover as suspects in her death, leaving her best friend, Lorraine Austin, in the hot seat.
I'm telling you, I did not kill my friend.
Could you have done it and not remember?
How would I kill my friend and not remember?
Because you seem to not remember everything else.
With Lorraine claiming innocence, investigators let her go, but they continue digging into her background.
So they find out that Lorraine is actually from Louisiana. She has no family ties to Crenshaw or LA.
We actually went to Crenshaw High School, where she said she went to school with our victim, and they had no record of her being a student there, let alone being friends with our victim.
But she does have family ties to Palmdale. They find that she lives with her mom, her stepfather, and her uncle, and that she's been unemployed for the past 2 years due to a traffic accident where she was a bus driver.
She didn't have a full-time job, money coming in. Every account that she had, whether it was a student loan, credit cards, utility bills, any account she had was either delinquent, it was written off as uncollectible, or was in arrears. Once we focused on Lorraine, we did a search warrant at her house as well as her sister's houses. Her computer and her phone records showed that she was lying about her relationship with our victim, Linnell Barsock. They'd only known each other for about a month.
Lorraine's internet search history reveals how she first crossed paths with Linnell.
When we looked through her computer, found that she was active on Craigslist. She had been active on the Women Seeking Women section of Craigslist.
Lorraine posted an ad seeking a woman to date, and Linnell answered. And they ended up meeting up, becoming friends, and developing a more romantic relationship.
The relationship between Lorraine and Linnell became sexual and romantic, and we found out that 5 days before the murder, on June 11th, Linnell sent a text to Lorraine saying that she wanted to terminate the romantic portion of that relationship, but instead wanted to try to make it work out with Lewis, her live-in boyfriend.
And Lorraine seems to accept this. She seems to be okay.
Records show Lorraine met several other women online.
They questioned them, and they say that they did actually meet up with Lorraine, except for they didn't call her Lorraine. Instead, she introduced herself as Crystal. Now, what made this fishy for detectives is that Crystal is Linnell's middle name, and Crystal is the name that Lorraine told detectives that she calls Linnell.
When Lorraine spoke to this female that she met on Craigslist, she spoke about a friend that she had, a female, and she started describing Linnell Barsock. But the way she described it, it was such a loving way, an amorous way, that that other lady told Lorraine Austin, the way you're talking about your friend, it sounds like you're in love with her.
Investigators believe that Lorraine's interest in Linnell sounds more than admiration. It sounds like obsession.
The deeper investigators dig into Lorraine's life, the darker the evidence grows.
The police discovered that Lorraine had purchased a 9mm pistol in February of 2010, and that's very important because that is the same caliber of bullet that was used to kill Linnell.
So the detectives are like, we've got to find this handgun that's really going to seal this case. So they get search dogs to go and search Lorraine's house. And these dogs, they're sniffing for the gun, but they come up short. They don't find anything.
Fortunately, we don't need a murder weapon to prove a case. We have enough evidence that we could prove the case without it.
All of the evidence that they collected from the crime scene is at the lab being tested, and they're getting the results back.
In the garage itself, we found a container, and on that container, we found a bloody fingerprint. The blood was later tested and came out that it was our victim's blood. It was Linnell Barsock's blood, and the fingerprint was later analyzed and turned out to be Lorraine Austin's.
They also find a mop and some black gloves that are also at this scene, and it has Lorraine's DNA on it, confirming that she was there and touching all of these things.
The day that she ran into that sheriff's station, the deputies took a sample of her fingers, and they submitted that sample to the crime lab, and they tested it for gunshot residue, and it came back positive. Lorraine Austin either fired a gun or was near a gun when it was fired that got gunshot residue on her hands.
Authorities present that evidence to a California grand jury in early 2011.
Lorraine Austin was indicted for the murder of Linnell Barsock in February 2011. However, when police went to her house to serve her arrest warrant for the murder, she was nowhere to be found.
We tried everything to try to find this girl, and nobody knew where she was.
In February of 2011, a California grand jury indicts Lorraine Austin for the murder of 29-year-old Linnell Barsock.
We were now ready to arrest her, and we tried everything to try to find this girl, and nobody knew where she was. We were not having any luck, so we decided we'd reach out to America's Most Wanted.
That America's Most Wanted episode airs on June 11th of 2011, almost exactly a year after the murder.
We got a phone call from a guy in New York, and this guy in New York said, I have a cousin that lives in Guatemala, and while I was there, another cousin showed up with his girlfriend. And that girlfriend, I swear to God, that is the girl that you guys are looking for in America's Most Wanted. When we reached out to the cousin in Guatemala, he said, well, she's not here anymore. They're in Belize now. So the FBI Fugitive Task Force reached out to their counterparts in the embassy in Belize.
On January 25, 2012, Lorraine is finally located and arrested in Belize and extradited to the United States to await trial.
On July 6, 2015, Lorraine Austin is finally taken to trial in Los Angeles County for the murder of Linnell Barsock.
Opening statements start with the prosecution talking about Lorraine, that she was a troubled woman. She was clearly obsessed with Linnell.
From the outside looking in, it seemed like Linnell had it all. Lorraine saw her big 6-bedroom house, her fancy BMW. She was educated and was making a career out of her life, where Lorraine was struggling. Her unemployment check stopped.
And Lorraine now sees an opportunity when she develops this romantic relationship with her, saying, this is what I want.
This wasn't just about wanting to be with Linnell. It was about wanting to be Linnell.
It would be easy for Lorraine to see Linnell as her meal ticket and her golden egg.
And I think Lorraine became obsessed with it to the point that it became toxic.
In just a few weeks, Lorraine's obsession began to push Linnell away.
And the moment she gets rejected, when Linnell says, no, I don't want that type of relationship with you, let's just be friends, all her dreams shattered. That built up a lot of anger in Lorraine, and she was jealous and envious that she could not have that lifestyle anymore.
This was the point where Lorraine's jealousy and obsession became dangerous. And this led to Lorraine's plans of taking Linnell's life.
Prosecutors walked the jury through the day of the murder.
The prosecutor paints the picture of the murder, saying that Linnell was watching TV as Lorraine was doing her hair.
As she was getting her hair done, that pillow was placed against her head, and the gun was placed against the pillow, and the gunshot went through the pillow into our victim's head.
Her body was dragged to the garage, and then there's an attempt to clean up.
The prosecutors then say that the only reason she didn't finish disposing of the body was because Lorraine's boyfriend, Ciego, called her and said that he and Lewis were done working on his car and that Lewis was now about to head to Palmdale.
And at that point is when she had to switch gears and say, you know what, I'm gonna write this Dear John letter.
Now, they had handwriting experts come in, and they were able to tell that that letter was not written by Linnell at all. That letter was composed by Lorraine.
Prosecutors say the letter was Lorraine's attempt to frame an innocent man, Louis Bonaire.
The evidence was overwhelming. They had lots of blood and lots of DNA evidence linking Lorraine to the crime.
It only took 8 hours for a jury of 12 of her peers to convict her of the murder of Linnell Barsock.
I think she deserved more, honestly. You know, she's still living, she's still breathing, she's still eating, she's still communicating with family, she's still celebrating birthdays, Mother's Day, whatever. Linnell's not.
Linnell was a loving, supportive sister, friend, cousin, aunt, and all of that was taken away because of jealousy.
It's a shame that her life was taken at such a young age. She had everything going for her, had a bright future.
She has made a difference, but she could have made a more impact on the world with her kindness, with her carefree attitude, with her love. And for somebody to take that away, it's like we all miss out. We all suffer because we don't have another light that shines on us.
So when you look at that picture, what memories come to you?
I would like everyone to remember Linnell as a love, full of life, fun person who loved everyone. I just want everybody to remember her as the way she was. She's so beautiful. She is beautiful. You are beautiful. And you're missed.
There are crimes that disappear with time, buried beneath fresh headlines and fading memories. And then there are crimes that refuse to die. Crimes that linger in quiet neighborhoods, haunt aging detectives, and force grieving parents to wonder, even 50 years later, whether the person responsible once walked past them on an ordinary afternoon. For decades, one name carried that unbearable weight across southeastern Michigan. The Oakland County child killer. Not because anyone knew who he was, but because nobody did. 4 children vanished. 4 children were murdered. Entire communities locked their doors before sunset. Parents stopped allowing children to ride bicycles alone. Schools rewrote dismissal procedures. Police departments from across the state poured thousands of hours into an investigation that grew larger, stranger, and more frustrating with every passing year. Rumors spread faster than facts. Psychics claimed they had visions. Anonymous callers taunted investigators. Dozens of suspects emerged. Hundreds were questioned. Thousands of tips flooded police switchboards. Yet the killer remained invisible. It became one of America's most infamous cold cases, a mystery so enduring that generations of detectives inherited boxes filled with fading photographs, handwritten witness statements, yellowing maps, and unanswered questions. Then, decades later, a single piece of biological evidence, almost forgotten inside police storage, would once again ignite hope. A DNA sample. Tiny. Silent. Waiting. It would not solve the case overnight. But it would prove that even half a century later, the investigation was still breathing. And somewhere beneath layers of history, mistakes, rumors, and dead ends, the truth might still exist. To understand why that tiny fragment mattered so much, you have to travel back to a different America. Michigan. The mid-1970s. Oakland County was changing rapidly. New subdivisions replaced farmland. Automobile factories powered the economy. Families poured into comfortable suburban neighborhoods believing they had found the safest places in the country to raise children. Kids rode bicycles until dark. Shopping centers became gathering places. Parents knew their neighbors. Children walked to nearby stores carrying a few dollars for candy or comic books. It was suburban America exactly as people imagined it should be. Safe. Predictable. Ordinary. Until one afternoon shattered that illusion forever. On July 22, 1976, 12-year-old Timothy King left his home in Birmingham with a simple plan. He wanted to ride his bicycle to a nearby shopping center. His father had promised to buy him a set of tires for the bike. Timothy arrived before his father. Witnesses remembered seeing the cheerful boy waiting patiently outside. Then, nothing. His father arrived minutes later. Timothy was gone. At first, there was no reason to panic. Perhaps he had wandered into another store. Maybe he had gone looking for friends. Children disappeared for short periods all the time. But minutes became hours. Hours became night. And an ordinary missing child report slowly transformed into something much darker. Police searched parking lots. Volunteers combed neighborhoods. Friends were interviewed. Family members were questioned. Roadblocks appeared. Helicopters scanned wooded areas. Every passing hour reduced the chances of finding Timothy alive. Then, 6 days later, the nightmare reached its horrifying conclusion. His body was discovered lying in a rural ditch. He had been carefully dressed. His clothing appeared clean. His shoes had been tied. There were indications he had been held alive for several days before being murdered. That detail changed everything. This wasn't an impulsive killer. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone had kidnapped a child, kept him alive, then deliberately decided when he would die. Michigan was horrified. But what terrified investigators even more was one unavoidable realization. Timothy King was not the first. Months earlier, another child had disappeared. Then another. Then another. Each case looked different on the surface. But together they formed a pattern too disturbing to ignore. The first known victim was 10-year-old Mark Stebbins. It was February 1976. Mark left home in Ferndale to walk only a few blocks toward a nearby American Legion Hall. He never arrived. His family reported him missing almost immediately. Police believed someone in the neighborhood must have seen something. After all, children rarely vanished without witnesses. Search teams flooded the area. Neighbors opened garages. Churches organized volunteers. Nothing. 4 days later, Mark's body was discovered in a parking lot. Like Timothy months later, he had been carefully dressed. His clothes appeared clean. His shoes were neatly tied. There were signs suggesting his body had been washed after death. It was almost as though the killer wanted to erase evidence. Or perhaps to erase guilt. Medical examiners documented every possible clue. Fibers. Hair. Injuries. Biological evidence. At the time, forensic science remained limited. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Investigators relied on fingerprints, blood typing, trace fibers, and painstaking detective work. Many of the tiny clues collected in 1976 would spend decades sitting inside evidence lockers, preserved for technologies that nobody could yet imagine. Just weeks after Mark's murder, another child disappeared. 12-year-old Jill Robinson left for a short shopping trip in Royal Oak. She never came home. The search exploded across Oakland County. Now fear was spreading. Parents no longer believed disappearances were isolated incidents. A predator was hunting children. Days later, Jill's body was found in another location. Again. Clean clothing. Little obvious forensic evidence. A carefully controlled crime scene. Someone understood how police investigations worked. Someone appeared calm enough to remove evidence. Someone showed remarkable patience. Then came Christine Mihalik. 10 years old. Bright. Friendly. She disappeared in January 1977 after walking to a neighborhood store in Berkeley. The pattern repeated itself. Massive searches. Television coverage. Community panic. Her body was eventually recovered in Franklin Village. Like the others, she had apparently been held alive. That detail haunted investigators more than anything else. Why keep the children alive? Why feed them? Why bathe them? Why return them dressed neatly before abandoning their bodies? The killer's behavior didn't fit familiar patterns. It seemed organized, methodical, almost ritualistic. Behavioral analysts would later spend years debating what these actions revealed about the offender's psychology. Some believed he viewed himself as a caretaker before becoming an executioner. Others argued the careful cleaning represented an attempt to destroy forensic evidence. Perhaps both explanations were true. Meanwhile, panic reached levels rarely seen in suburban America. Parents formed neighborhood patrols. Schools instructed children never to walk alone. Shopping centers hired additional security. Police officers visited classrooms explaining stranger danger years before the phrase became common nationwide. Children learned new rules. Never accept rides. Never talk to strangers. Never walk alone. Never assume daylight meant safety. Oakland County had changed forever. The investigation became enormous. Jurisdictions that rarely worked together suddenly shared information daily. State police joined local departments. Federal agencies offered assistance. Behavioral experts reviewed files. Telephone hotlines operated around the clock. Thousands upon thousands of leads poured in. Some tips sounded believable. Others were bizarre. People reported suspicious vans. Strange men near schools. Unusual conversations. Anonymous confessions. Psychic predictions. Every possibility demanded attention because detectives could not afford to ignore anything. Yet each promising lead eventually collapsed. Witness descriptions conflicted. Vehicle sightings varied wildly. Some reported blue cars. Others remembered black sedans. Some described older men. Others insisted the suspect appeared young. Memory proved unreliable. Fear distorted perception. Rumors spread throughout neighborhoods until they became accepted as fact. One of the strangest elements involved anonymous communications. Over time, letters and telephone calls emerged claiming knowledge about the murders. Some appeared designed merely to frighten investigators. Others contained details that raised uncomfortable questions. Was the killer contacting police? Or was someone exploiting public fear? Determining the difference consumed valuable investigative resources. Then came another unsettling realization. The children had not been taken by force in crowded public places. Most evidence suggested they willingly approached whoever abducted them. That implied trust. Perhaps the killer looked respectable. Perhaps he displayed authority. Perhaps he offered assistance. Or maybe the children had encountered him before. Detectives began examining everyone. Teachers, coaches, maintenance workers, delivery drivers, clergy, neighbors, security guards, anyone whose daily routine placed them near children. Thousands of interviews generated mountains of paperwork. Still no arrest. As months turned into years, frustration mounted inside every agency connected to the investigation. Detectives worked exhausting hours. Parents demanded answers. Reporters chased every rumor. Political pressure intensified. The public wanted reassurance. Instead, police offered uncertainty. Behind closed doors, investigators argued about the offender's profile. Was there one killer? Could multiple offenders be involved? Did the murders connect to organized abuse? Were influential individuals somehow protected? Theories multiplied because evidence remained painfully incomplete. Among investigators, one concern kept resurfacing. the offender appeared remarkably disciplined. He selected victims carefully. He controlled them for days. He released bodies in locations chosen deliberately. He left almost nothing behind. That level of organization suggested experience. Or intelligence. Or both. Then, almost as suddenly as the murders began, they stopped. No confirmed fifth victim emerged fitting the same unmistakable pattern. Years passed. Children grew into adults. Neighborhoods expanded. Shopping centers were rebuilt. Police officers retired. Boxes of evidence moved from one storage room to another. Some witnesses died. Some suspects disappeared. Others reinvented themselves under ordinary lives. The case gradually transformed from an active investigation into one of America's most haunting cold cases. But cold never meant forgotten. Every few years, another promising suspect surfaced. Every few years, another headline declared investigators might finally be close. And every time, hope faded once more. Families of the victims learned to protect themselves from disappointment. They attended anniversaries, held memorials, spoke with journalists, answered the same painful questions. Who do you think did it? Do you still believe justice will come? What would you say if the killer were watching? No parent ever truly stopped waiting. No detective ever completely stopped wondering. Because somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports lay one overlooked detail. One missed interview. One forgotten witness. One tiny fragment of evidence collected long before anyone understood what science would someday be capable of revealing. Locked away inside an evidence vault, untouched for decades, microscopic biological material waited in absolute silence. When investigators first sealed it into an evidence envelope during the 1970s, they could never have imagined that future laboratories would read genetic code the way detectives once read fingerprints. Half a century later, that forgotten evidence would return to the center of the investigation, reopening old wounds, reviving impossible questions, and forcing everyone connected to Michigan's darkest child murder mystery to confront a chilling possibility. The Oakland County child killer had hidden from detectives for nearly 50 years. But the killer may have left behind something far more patient than memory. DNA. For nearly half a century, the evidence sat in silence. Cardboard boxes lined aging shelves inside secure police storage rooms. Plastic bags yellowed with time. Evidence envelopes carried handwritten dates from an era when detectives wore wide ties, dictated reports onto cassette recorders, and believed fingerprints represented the pinnacle of forensic science. Every item had been catalogued with the hope that one day it might speak. Most never did. Yet the Oakland County child killer file was different. Detectives who inherited the case from retiring investigators often described the same feeling. Opening those boxes was like walking into a room where everyone had suddenly disappeared. Every photograph captured smiling children who never grew up. Every interview transcript froze a parent's worst day in permanent ink. Every map marked locations forever associated with grief. And somewhere among thousands of pages rested evidence collected long before anyone understood its true value. Back in the late 1970s, investigators gathered virtually everything they could find. Hair. Carpet fibers. Clothing. Fingernail scrapings. Swabs. Tiny biological traces invisible to the naked eye. They preserved them because good detectives never threw evidence away. They simply had no technology capable of extracting the answers hidden inside it. DNA profiling would not become a practical investigative tool until years later. By then, the Oakland County murders had already entered American criminal history. The case became the subject of documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, university research papers, and endless speculation among true crime enthusiasts. Amateur investigators built timelines covering every reported sighting. Internet forums exploded with theories once the digital age arrived. Some believed the killer had died decades earlier. Others insisted he had simply moved away and continued offending elsewhere under another identity. Law enforcement refused to close the file. Not because they possessed a suspect. Because they still possessed evidence. That distinction mattered. Every few years, advances in forensic science encouraged investigators to reopen sealed packages. Laboratories that once required large blood samples could now analyze microscopic quantities. DNA amplification techniques transformed previously unusable material into potentially valuable evidence. New methods recovered genetic profiles from objects that earlier generations of scientists would have considered hopeless. Cases older than the investigators themselves suddenly became solvable. Across the United States, headlines began appearing with astonishing regularity. Cold case solved after 30 years. Serial offender identified through DNA. Victim finally receives justice after decades. Families who had almost abandoned hope watched strangers knock on their front doors carrying news they never expected to hear. Michigan detectives watched those stories closely. Each successful identification raised the same painful question. Could Oakland County be next? The answer depended entirely upon whether enough biological evidence had survived. Forensic specialists carefully reopened long-sealed evidence containers using procedures unimaginable in 1977. Modern laboratories operated under strict contamination controls. Protective clothing replaced the casual handling once common decades earlier. Every movement was documented. Every transfer recorded. Every sample treated as irreplaceable. Because it was. Unlike modern investigations, there would never be another opportunity to collect additional evidence from the original crime scenes. Time had erased them. Parking lots had been repaved. Roads widened. Buildings demolished. Forests cleared. Witnesses forgotten details. Only the preserved evidence remained untouched by history. Scientists began examining clothing belonging to the victims once again. The garments told silent stories. Fabric fibers. Microscopic debris. Invisible biological residue. Most yielded little. Decades of storage, environmental degradation, and earlier forensic testing had consumed portions of the original material. Some samples simply no longer contained enough intact DNA for meaningful analysis. But not all. One sample stood apart. Tiny. Almost insignificant. Yet unlike fingerprints, DNA carried something unique. Identity. Unlike eyewitness testimony, it did not forget. Unlike confessions, it did not lie. Unlike rumors, it demanded scientific verification. The profile recovered was incomplete, but investigators believed it originated from an unknown male connected in some way to the evidence. Immediately, caution replaced excitement. An unknown DNA profile does not automatically belong to a killer. It could belong to an investigator. A laboratory technician. A member of the victim's family. Someone who innocently handled clothing before collection. Or it could belong to the person every detective had been searching for since the Ford administration. Before making any public announcement, scientists worked to eliminate innocent sources. Police officers who handled evidence were reviewed whenever possible. Laboratory records were examined. Historical documentation became critically important. Who collected the evidence? Who packaged it? Who transported it? Who tested it? Each answer removed another possibility. Only then could investigators begin asking the question everyone wanted answered. Whose DNA was it? The obvious step involved comparing the profile against known offenders. National databases contained millions of genetic records collected from convicted criminals. Violent offenders, sexual predators, repeat felons, many had submitted DNA under state or federal law. The unknown profile entered the system. Investigators waited. Nothing. No direct match. The silence was crushing. If the killer had never been arrested for a qualifying offense, his DNA would never appear. If he had died before modern collection laws existed, the databases would remain empty. If he had lived an otherwise ordinary life, he could still be invisible. The investigation entered another phase. Instead of asking whether the DNA belonged to someone already known, detectives began considering whether science could identify relatives. That idea sounded almost impossible only a few years earlier. Then one California investigation changed everything. The identification of the Golden State Killer demonstrated the extraordinary potential of investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than searching for exact DNA matches, experts searched for distant biological relatives through publicly available genealogy databases used by ordinary people tracing family histories. Suddenly, detectives no longer needed the killer himself to submit DNA. A cousin might unknowingly provide the missing connection. A second cousin. A great-aunt. A nephew. Family trees stretching back generations became investigative roadmaps. Law enforcement agencies across America recognized a revolution had begun. Michigan investigators watched carefully. Could the same approach finally expose the Oakland County child killer? The possibility electrified retired detectives. Some had spent entire careers chasing shadows. Now, for the first time, they possessed something tangible. Not a witness statement. Not a rumor. Not a psychological profile. A genetic signature. Even if incomplete. Former investigators who had worked the original murders returned to offer whatever memories remained. Many admitted that reading old reports stirred emotions they believed time had buried. They remembered exhausted search parties. Endless press conferences. Parents staring hopefully each time a telephone rang. They also remembered mistakes. Every major investigation contains them. Tips misplaced. Communication failures. Jurisdictional disagreements. Potential witnesses interviewed too late. Evidence interpreted through the limitations of its era. No detective wanted to believe an answer had been missed. Yet after 50 years, honesty demanded acknowledging that possibility. The Oakland County investigation had grown so enormous that even experienced officers occasionally lost track of individual leads. More than a dozen agencies became involved at different stages. Information moved through filing cabinets rather than digital databases. Cross-referencing thousands of reports required human memory. Human memory fails. Retired investigators openly discussed one frustration that continued haunting them. Too many suspects. Over the years, almost anyone displaying unusual behavior around children attracted attention. Some possessed criminal histories. Others merely fit public suspicion. The investigation generated lists upon lists of possible offenders. Several names repeatedly surfaced. Each seemed promising. Each ultimately failed to produce enough evidence for prosecution. One suspect generated extraordinary attention because his background appeared disturbingly compatible with the crimes. Another reportedly resembled composite sketches circulated during the investigation. Others had histories involving children. Still others allegedly made incriminating statements later repeated through rumor more often than documentation. Every promising lead eventually collapsed beneath scrutiny. No fingerprints. No definitive forensic evidence. No reliable eyewitness identification. No confession supported by independent proof. Years later, the newly recovered DNA profile created an entirely different standard. Every historical suspect could now be re-evaluated. Not through speculation. Through science. Where biological samples from deceased suspects existed, comparisons became possible. Where living individuals voluntarily cooperated, or where investigators lawfully obtained discarded DNA, additional testing could occur. One by one, names that had haunted the case for decades faced scientific examination. Some were excluded. Others remained impossible to evaluate because suitable comparison samples no longer existed. The process proved slow. Painfully slow. Public expectations moved much faster than laboratory reality. News reports occasionally suggested breakthroughs. Online discussions exploded. Families received telephone calls asking whether an arrest was imminent. Most of the time, investigators answered carefully. The work continued. No conclusions yet. Behind that restraint lay another challenge rarely appreciated outside forensic science. The DNA profile itself was limited. Unlike pristine modern crime scene samples, decades-old biological material often produces only partial genetic information. Analysts must determine whether enough markers exist to support meaningful comparisons. Every additional test risks consuming precious evidence forever. There are no second chances. Scientists therefore balanced urgency against preservation. Destroy too much material today, and future technologies may lose opportunities tomorrow. Preserve too much, and current investigative avenues remain unexplored. Every decision carried weight. Meanwhile, another mystery refused to disappear. Why had the murders stopped? If the Oakland County child killer remained unidentified, what ended the series? Did he die? Move away? Enter prison for unrelated crimes? Change his behavior? Or had investigators failed to recognize later victims elsewhere? Criminal profilers remain divided. Some believed offenders capable of such organized violence rarely stop voluntarily. Others pointed toward age, illness, or major life changes capable of interrupting offending patterns. Still others argued the killer may have narrowly escaped detection and deliberately abandoned his crimes. Without knowing his identity, every explanation remained speculative. The families lived inside that uncertainty every day. Parents who once appeared on evening news broadcasts begging for information became elderly. Some passed away before witnessing meaningful forensic progress. Siblings who lost brothers and sisters spent lifetimes answering questions from strangers. Birthdays remained frozen. Photographs never changed. The children stayed forever 10, 11, and 12 years old while everyone else grew old around them. Every new development reopened emotional wounds. Hope became complicated. Hope meant possibility. Hope also meant preparing for disappointment once again. Still, detectives refused to surrender. Modern investigative teams digitized mountains of historical paperwork. Thousands of handwritten reports entered searchable databases. Geographic information systems recreated timelines impossible to visualize during the original investigation. Vehicle sightings, witness statements, suspect movements, and telephone records could now be compared within minutes instead of months. Technology accomplished in hours what once demanded teams of detectives working for weeks. Patterns previously hidden by paper files slowly emerged. Some confirmed earlier theories. Others challenged assumptions accepted for decades. Every discovery led investigators back toward the same central question. Who had access to these children without provoking immediate fear? Because despite everything learned over 50 years, one fact remained remarkably consistent. The victims appeared comfortable enough to go with someone voluntarily. That suggested familiarity, authority, trust, or extraordinary manipulation. The unknown DNA profile represented more than biological evidence. It represented the first truly objective voice in a case dominated for decades by uncertain memories and conflicting testimony. It could not reveal motive. It could not explain why the children had been kept alive. It could not describe what happened inside those missing days. But perhaps, someday, it could identify the person who had been there. And if that happened, every forgotten interview, every abandoned lead, every dismissed suspicion would suddenly acquire an entirely different meaning. Because somewhere inside the thousands of names collected since 1976, investigators increasingly feared that one of them had been dangerously close to the truth all along. The deeper investigators looked into the Oakland County child killer case, the more unsettling one fact became. The murders were not chaotic. They were controlled. Every known victim disappeared from a public place in broad daylight. Shopping centers. Neighborhood streets. Short walks that should have lasted only minutes. There were no frantic screams reported. No violent struggles witnessed by crowds. No obvious scenes of abduction. Children simply vanished. To seasoned investigators, that suggested planning far beyond opportunity. Someone understood how children thought. Someone knew where they would be. Someone knew how to gain their trust in less than a minute. That realization transformed the investigation. Instead of searching only for violent criminals, detectives widened their focus to include people who appeared completely ordinary. A friendly neighbor. A maintenance worker. A delivery driver. A volunteer coach. A security guard. Anyone whose presence near children would not immediately trigger alarm. Behavioral specialists studying the case reached another disturbing conclusion. The offender appeared patient. Serial predators driven purely by impulse often leave chaos behind. They act quickly, make mistakes, abandon victims wherever panic overtakes them. The Oakland County offender behaved differently. Evidence suggested at least some victims had been kept alive for several days. That required preparation. A secure location. Privacy. Food. Water. Time. The killer wasn't simply escaping detection. He was managing captives. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. Somewhere within driving distance of suburban Detroit, there may have been a location where children were held without attracting suspicion. A house. An apartment. A vacant property. A workshop. Perhaps even a business. Investigators revisited every report concerning suspicious buildings from the 1970s. Old search warrants were reviewed. Rental records examined. Property ownership histories reconstructed. Many locations no longer existed. Entire neighborhoods had changed. Factories had closed. Commercial districts had been redeveloped. Physical evidence disappeared beneath decades of construction. Only paperwork remained. As retired detectives compared memories, another recurring theme emerged. The children had not appeared neglected during captivity. Medical findings suggested they had received food. Some evidence indicated they had been bathed shortly before their bodies were left. Clean clothing. Combed hair. Shoes neatly tied. Those details seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the brutality of the crimes themselves. Why would someone capable of murdering children take the time to clean them? Some psychologists believed this reflected an offender attempting to separate himself emotionally from the violence. Others argued it represented pure forensic awareness. Wash away fibers. Destroy fingerprints. Remove trace evidence. Reduce the chances of identification. Perhaps compassion had nothing to do with it. Perhaps every seemingly gentle act served a practical purpose. Still, investigators struggled with another contradiction. If forensic concealment explained everything, why leave the bodies where they would eventually be found? The killer could have buried them. Burned evidence. Transported victims across state lines. Instead, the bodies were left in locations where discovery appeared inevitable. Not immediately. But eventually. It was as though someone wanted them found. Just not too quickly. That distinction fascinated criminal profilers. The delay bought valuable time. Evidence deteriorated. Witness memories faded. Search efforts shifted elsewhere. Yet recovery remained certain enough to generate headlines. The killer seemed to understand both police procedure and public reaction. Whether that knowledge came from experience or careful observation remained unknown. As investigators re-examined thousands of interviews, one category demanded renewed attention. Witnesses who reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles. Automobiles played a central role throughout the original investigation. Children disappearing in suburban environments rarely travel far on foot. Someone almost certainly transported them. Descriptions varied enormously. Blue sedans. Brown station wagons. Dark-colored luxury cars. Panel vans. Compact vehicles. No single description appeared consistently enough to establish certainty. But detectives recognized an important limitation. Eyewitnesses often focus on people rather than automobiles. Many reports came from children. Others originated days after disappearances. Memory is fragile, especially under stress. Still, investigators mapped every reported vehicle sighting. Some patterns emerged. Others dissolved under scrutiny. One witness remembered a child speaking with a well-dressed man. Another recalled a vehicle parked unusually close to a shopping center entrance. Others noticed nothing at all. The lack of consistency frustrated detectives. Yet it also supported a troubling hypothesis. The offender blended naturally into ordinary suburban life. Nothing about him appeared immediately threatening. That ability to disappear in plain sight became one of the investigation's defining characteristics. As years passed, speculation filled the gaps left by missing evidence. Books appeared. Television specials aired. Podcasts debated competing theories. Some suggested a lone offender. Others proposed multiple participants. One theory centered on an organized child exploitation network operating quietly beneath respectable society. Another argued that the crimes reflected a single highly intelligent sexual predator acting alone. Law enforcement consistently warned the public to distinguish between verified evidence and speculation. The distinction mattered. Many theories sounded convincing. Few survived careful examination. Investigators repeatedly emphasized that while rumors spread rapidly, successful prosecutions require evidence. Not suspicion. Not coincidence. Not public opinion. Evidence. That standard became especially important as several high-profile suspects entered public discussion. Among them was Christopher Bush. His name would become inseparable from the Oakland County investigation, despite the fact that no court ever convicted him of the murders. Bush came from a wealthy and influential family. His father was a prominent executive connected to the automotive industry. Christopher himself attracted police attention because of allegations involving young boys. His background appeared troubling. His lifestyle raised questions. His name surfaced repeatedly during various stages of the investigation. At different times, investigators reportedly examined whether Bush could be connected to the child murders. Searches were conducted. Witnesses interviewed. Rumors multiplied. Some former investigators believed he deserved closer scrutiny than he received. Others argued available evidence simply failed to establish the necessary connection. The public rarely appreciated that difference. Once a suspect's name entered newspaper headlines, many assumed guilt. Police could not. Without sufficient evidence, suspicion remained exactly that. Suspicion. Years later, Bush died by suicide in 1978 under circumstances that fueled even more speculation. His death guaranteed certain questions would never be answered directly. Could he have known something? Was he involved? Was he entirely unrelated? The investigation never produced definitive proof establishing him as the Oakland County child killer. Another frequently discussed figure was Gregory Green. Years after the child murders, Green committed horrific crimes involving members of his own family. His capacity for violence caused some observers to wonder whether he might also be responsible for the earlier killings. Investigators examined the possibility. Available evidence failed to support that conclusion. Like many others, Green became part of the growing list of names considered but never conclusively linked. The case accumulated suspects the way old houses accumulate dust. Each generation added another layer. Some based on evidence. Others on rumor. Some because of genuine investigative necessity. Others because public fear demanded answers. Retired detectives often expressed concern that speculation sometimes overshadowed facts. They understood the temptation. The human mind dislikes unanswered questions. When certainty disappears, imagination fills the void. Yet imagination solves nothing. Forensic science does. That is precisely why the DNA evidence carried extraordinary importance. Unlike witness memory, it would not evolve over time. Unlike rumors, it remained immune to repetition. If connected to the offender, it possessed the potential to eliminate decades of uncertainty. But another challenge complicated the search. The genetic profile recovered from preserved evidence did not instantly identify anyone. It represented a doorway, not the destination. Investigators still needed comparisons. Reference samples. Family connections. Genealogical research. Every step required painstaking work. And patience. Lots of patience. Meanwhile, surviving family members continued living with memories no laboratory could analyze. For Timothy King's parents, July never became an ordinary month again. Every anniversary reopened wounds. For Mark Stebbins' relatives, a simple neighborhood walk remained forever associated with unimaginable loss. The families of Jill Robinson and Christine Mihalik carried similar burdens. Time changes grief. It rarely erases it. Many spoke publicly over the years not because reliving the murders brought comfort, but because silence threatened something worse. Forgetting. They refused to allow their children to become historical footnotes. Each victim had dreams. Favorite television shows. Friends. School assignments left unfinished. Birthdays that never arrived. The Oakland County child killer stole far more than 4 young lives. He altered an entire generation's understanding of safety. Children growing up in southeastern Michigan during the late 1970s often recall the same memories. Never walk alone. Never accept rides. Check in constantly. Look over your shoulder. Parents who had once encouraged independence suddenly measured freedom in minutes. Communities organized escort programs. Shopping centers increased patrols. Schools implemented identification procedures unheard of only a few years earlier. The murders became part of childhood itself. Fear replaced innocence. Detectives sometimes reflected upon another painful reality. The investigation succeeded in one important respect. After Timothy King's murder, the known series stopped. Whether through luck, increased public awareness, or unrelated circumstances, no confirmed 5th victim fitting the same pattern emerged. No investigator considered that a victory. But many quietly wondered whether extraordinary media attention had disrupted the offender's confidence. Perhaps heightened patrols made further kidnappings too risky. Perhaps the killer recognized that every parent now watched strangers differently. Or perhaps events entirely unrelated to police efforts changed his life forever. Without identifying him, no answer remained certain. As forensic laboratories continued extracting every possible clue from surviving evidence, another development transformed cold case investigations across America. Digital technology. Thousands of handwritten investigative files entered searchable computer systems. Detectives no longer relied solely upon memory or paper indexes. Algorithms compared names appearing across unrelated reports. Addresses connected multiple witnesses. Telephone numbers resurfaced decades after first being recorded. Vehicle registrations became easier to trace. The Oakland County file underwent that transformation as well. Researchers discovered forgotten interviews. Duplicate reports. Minor inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. No smoking gun. But investigations rarely hinge upon dramatic discoveries. More often, they advance through hundreds of tiny corrections, gradually revealing a clearer picture. The picture emerging from Oakland County remained incomplete. Yet one feature grew increasingly sharp. Whoever committed these crimes possessed remarkable discipline. He minimized physical evidence. Controlled victims for extended periods. Navigated suburban communities without attracting immediate suspicion. And vanished before investigators understood whom they were chasing. That combination explained why the mystery survived generation after generation. It also explained why one microscopic DNA sample suddenly carried the weight of 50 years. Because if science could finally place a name beside that genetic profile, every theory would face the same unforgiving test. Not whether it sounded believable, but whether it matched the evidence left behind by the only witness that had remained silent since 1977. The killer's own biology. For investigators, the hardest cases are not always the ones with the least evidence. Sometimes they are the ones with too much. By the early 1980s, the Oakland County child killer investigation had expanded into an ocean of information. Filing cabinets overflowed with witness statements. Thousands of tips had been logged. Hundreds of individuals had been interviewed. Every detective assigned to the case inherited not only evidence but decades of assumptions made by those who came before. Some assumptions proved correct. Others quietly steered the investigation down roads that led nowhere. One retired investigator later described the case as a giant puzzle assembled from pieces belonging to several different boxes. Every new lead appeared promising until another contradicted it. Every suspect seemed plausible until an alibi surfaced. Every apparent breakthrough dissolved beneath closer examination. The result was a case that never truly stopped growing. As technology improved, investigators returned to the original witness interviews with fresh eyes. Not because they believed earlier detectives had failed. Because people often reveal information differently when viewed through modern investigative methods. Statements that once seemed insignificant could suddenly acquire enormous importance. A child mentioning a familiar face. A store employee recalling an unusual customer. A motorist remembering an unfamiliar vehicle parked in an odd location. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they formed the edges of a picture still missing its center. One recurring question resurfaced repeatedly. How did the offender convince children to leave voluntarily? The answer could determine everything. Experts in child abduction behavior generally recognize several common approaches. Authority. Urgency. Kindness. Deception. A predator might pretend to be a police officer. Claim that a parent had been injured. Ask for help finding a lost pet. Offer a ride. Promise a reward. Children raised to trust adults often complied before recognizing danger. The Oakland County victims disappeared so quickly that investigators believed the initial contact must have lasted only moments. No prolonged conversation. No visible struggle. Just enough time for trust to replace caution. Behavioral analysts suggested another possibility. Perhaps the children never believed they were leaving with a stranger. Perhaps the offender had become a familiar presence long before the abductions occurred. Someone regularly seen near schools. Someone who visited shopping centers. Someone children recognized without actually knowing. The idea was chilling because it implied preparation extending weeks or even months before each disappearance. Predators sometimes study routines. Observe habits. Learn schedules. Identify which children walk alone. Understand where parents expect them to be. Such preparation dramatically reduces risk. Investigators therefore reconstructed the victims' daily lives in extraordinary detail. Where they attended school. Favorite stores. Weekend routines. Friends. Sports. Family habits. Routes they regularly walked. Every common location became part of the investigation. Maps covered entire conference room walls. Colored pins identified disappearances, sightings, body recovery sites, suspected vehicle locations, and known addresses connected to persons of interest. At first glance, the maps appeared chaotic. Over time, patterns emerged. The abductions occurred within relatively familiar suburban environments. The recovery sites, however, suggested someone comfortable driving throughout Oakland County. Not someone randomly passing through. Someone who understood local roads. Someone familiar with quiet locations unlikely to attract immediate attention. That realization narrowed possibilities without identifying anyone. Knowledge of the area described thousands of residents. Still, detectives believed geography mattered. Criminals often operate inside comfort zones. Not necessarily near home, but within areas they know well. The investigation increasingly focused upon individuals whose occupations required extensive local travel. Sales representatives. Maintenance workers. Utility employees. Contractors. Delivery personnel. Anyone capable of moving throughout multiple communities without attracting attention. Again, interviews followed. Again, records were reviewed. Again, no definitive answer emerged. Then investigators encountered another mystery. Telephone calls. Throughout the investigation, police received communications from anonymous individuals claiming knowledge about the murders. Some callers sounded frightened. Others sounded confident. Several appeared determined to waste investigators' time. Determining which category mattered proved extraordinarily difficult. One anonymous caller claimed to possess inside information unavailable to the general public. Another hinted that multiple offenders were involved. Still others simply repeated rumors already circulating through neighborhoods. Every call required evaluation. Every recording underwent analysis. Voice comparisons. Background noise. Linguistic patterns. Investigators explored every possibility available at the time. Nothing produced an identification. Years later, retired detectives remained divided over whether any anonymous communication genuinely originated from the offender. Some believed at least one call contained details unlikely to be fabricated. Others argued that widespread media coverage made such knowledge easier to obtain than many realized. The truth remained uncertain. Another controversial aspect of the investigation involved reports suggesting connections between individuals from affluent backgrounds and allegations of child exploitation. Because several persons of interest came from prominent families, rumors quickly spread that influential people had interfered with the investigation. These allegations persisted for decades. Law enforcement repeatedly stated that while numerous individuals had indeed been investigated, no verified evidence established a coordinated effort to shield the killer from prosecution. That distinction often became blurred in public discussion. The existence of influential suspects does not automatically prove institutional protection. Nor does it eliminate the possibility. Investigators therefore continued examining evidence rather than speculation. The surviving records revealed extensive investigative activity involving multiple persons of interest. Search warrants, interviews, evidence collection, surveillance. These actions suggested that detectives pursued numerous leads aggressively, even when politically uncomfortable. Whether every possible avenue received equal attention remains a matter historians and investigators continue to debate. One thing, however, became increasingly clear. The original detectives faced enormous limitations. Modern investigators enjoy instant access to nationwide criminal databases. Digital communications. Automatic license plate systems. Cell phone records. DNA analysis. Security camera footage. None of those tools existed in 1976. When a witness reported seeing a suspicious vehicle, detectives manually checked registrations. When another jurisdiction developed information, paperwork traveled through mail or telephone. Comparing thousands of names required weeks rather than minutes. The Oakland County investigation unfolded inside that technological reality. It is impossible to know how differently the case might have progressed using 21st-century resources. Perhaps the offender would have been identified within days. Or perhaps he would still have escaped. Experienced investigators remain cautious about rewriting history. Technology solves many problems. Human behavior still creates most mysteries. As forensic laboratories continued reviewing preserved evidence decades later, scientists recognized another challenge. Contamination. Evidence collected during the 1970s often passed through multiple hands before long-term storage. Protective gloves were not universally used in every circumstance. Laboratory standards differed from modern protocols. Items might have been examined repeatedly over decades. Consequently, every detected DNA profile required careful interpretation. Did the genetic material originate during the crime? Or years afterward? Scientists documented each possibility meticulously. The unknown male DNA profile attracted particular attention precisely because analysts believed it deserved further investigation. Not because they had conclusively proven it belonged to the offender. Responsible forensic science rarely offers certainty without qualification. Instead, investigators treated the profile as an important lead requiring additional context. That cautious approach frustrated portions of the public. Many assumed DNA automatically solved crimes. Reality proved more complicated. DNA identifies biological contact, not necessarily criminal responsibility. A person's genetic material can appear on clothing through entirely innocent circumstances depending upon the facts of each case. Context transforms evidence into proof. Without context, science answers only part of the question. Detectives therefore combined laboratory findings with traditional investigation. Old suspects. Historical movements. Witness testimony. Employment histories. Associations. Vehicle ownership. Every element had to fit together. One mismatch could eliminate an otherwise promising theory. During renewed reviews, investigators also examined unsolved child murders across neighboring states. Could the Oakland County child killer have operated beyond Michigan? Several cases displayed superficial similarities. Young victims. Abductions. Bodies recovered elsewhere. But similarities alone cannot establish a common offender. Behavioral patterns often overlap. Investigators searched for stronger connections. Travel records. Known suspects. Forensic evidence. Geographic relationships. Most comparisons ended inconclusively. Still, detectives refused to dismiss the possibility entirely. Serial offenders sometimes cross jurisdictional boundaries specifically to complicate investigations. If the Oakland County offender relocated after 1977, later crimes might never have been linked. That uncertainty remained another reason preserving DNA evidence proved so critical. Future comparisons could reveal connections impossible to detect through traditional methods. The families followed every development with guarded optimism. Public statements from relatives often reflected the same emotional balance. Hope. Tempered by experience. They had watched countless headlines promise breakthroughs. Most ended quietly. Yet none dismissed the value of continued investigation. Justice delayed remained preferable to justice abandoned. Some family members participated in documentaries not to revisit personal tragedy, but to keep public attention alive. Cold cases often depend upon memory. Someone who remained silent decades earlier may eventually decide to speak. A witness burdened by fear. A relative noticing suspicious behavior long ago. A friend remembering an overlooked conversation. Time changes people. Loyalty weakens. Conscience grows louder. Detectives frequently remind the public that old investigations sometimes break because of entirely new witnesses rather than new technology. The Oakland County case could still follow that path. Meanwhile, advances in investigative genetic genealogy continued reshaping criminal investigations nationwide. Cases once considered impossible suddenly reached astonishing conclusions. Unknown offenders acquired names. Family trees reconstructed identities stretching across generations. Michigan investigators watched these successes closely, knowing their own unidentified DNA profile might someday benefit from the same scientific evolution. Every year laboratories improved. Every year computational methods became more sophisticated. Every year tiny fragments of biological material yielded information previously thought unrecoverable. Patience became part of the strategy. The killer had hidden for nearly 50 years. Investigators could afford to wait a little longer if better science increased the chances of success. Yet beneath every technical discussion remained a hauntingly simple truth. 4 children trusted someone. They disappeared without understanding the danger standing beside them. For days, they remained beyond the reach of desperate parents searching every street, every parking lot, every wooded trail. Then they were returned to the world with disturbing care, as though the person responsible wanted to erase every visible trace of violence while leaving behind an emotional wound that would never heal. It was a contradiction detectives still struggled to explain. A murderer meticulous enough to wash away evidence. A predator calm enough to comb a child's hair. A killer capable of calculated cruelty wrapped inside gestures that appeared almost ordinary. That contradiction suggested something deeply unsettling. The Oakland County child killer was almost certainly living 2 completely different lives. One visible to the world. The other hidden so completely that for half a century, no investigation had been able to expose the man standing between them. By the time the investigation entered its 2nd decade, something almost as dangerous as the killer himself had begun to shape the case. Time. Time erases faces. Time weakens memory. Time buries evidence beneath new construction, new families, and new lives. But time also has another effect. It changes the questions investigators ask. The detectives who first stood over the victims' bodies in 1976 and 1977 approached the crimes through the knowledge available to them. They searched for fingerprints, blood types, tire tracks, and eyewitnesses. They relied heavily on interviews because there was little else capable of identifying an unknown offender. The detectives who inherited the case years later saw something entirely different. They viewed every report through the lens of modern criminal profiling. They no longer asked only who could have committed the murders. They asked what kind of person could sustain such control without making obvious mistakes. That distinction mattered. Most violent offenders reveal themselves eventually. They commit additional crimes. They offend recklessly. They leave evidence. They boast. They confess. They unravel under pressure. The Oakland County child killer seemed to do none of those things. If the same individual committed all 4 murders, he displayed remarkable consistency. He selected victims within a narrow age range. He targeted children traveling alone. He avoided public confrontation. He maintained control during captivity. He disposed of the bodies in carefully chosen locations. Then he disappeared. Not just from the crime scenes. From history itself. Behavioral analysts increasingly believed they were dealing with someone capable of compartmentalizing his life with extraordinary precision. By day, he may have appeared completely ordinary. He might have held a stable job. Paid his bills. Attended church. Spoken politely to neighbors. Nothing in his outward behavior may have hinted at the violence concealed beneath the surface. History has shown that many organized offenders are not social outcasts. Some are respected members of their communities. Others build families, careers, and reputations while hiding lives that even those closest to them never suspect. That possibility unsettled investigators more than almost anything else. Because it meant the killer may have attended community events alongside the very families searching for missing children. He may have watched television coverage of the investigation. He may have read newspaper articles describing his own crimes. Perhaps he even discussed the murders with coworkers. The thought was impossible to dismiss. Serial offenders have often demonstrated a disturbing fascination with investigations involving their own crimes. Some collect newspaper clippings. Some revisit crime scenes. Some volunteer information to police. Others simply enjoy watching fear spread through communities. Whether the Oakland County offender behaved similarly remains unknown. No verified evidence ever placed a specific suspect inside the investigation in such a manner. Still, detectives considered every possibility. As behavioral science evolved through the 1980s and 1990s, profilers revisited the case repeatedly. One characteristic continued to stand out: control. Everything about the murder suggested planning rather than impulse. Victims disappeared quickly. Evidence remained limited. Bodies appeared in locations selected with care. Nothing indicated hurried decisions. Someone who operates with that level of discipline often rehearses mentally long before acting physically. The crimes themselves become the final stage of preparation already completed inside the offender's mind. That observation encouraged investigators to revisit reports of suspicious behavior occurring weeks before each disappearance. Had anyone noticed the same unfamiliar man repeatedly visiting shopping centers? Had someone been watching playgrounds? Did store employees remember a customer who never seemed interested in shopping? Thousands of interviews were re-examined. Many witnesses had died. Others remembered little. A few recalled details that had seemed meaningless decades earlier. One remembered an unfamiliar man sitting alone for unusually long periods. Another recalled someone speaking comfortably with neighborhood children. None of these recollections proved criminal conduct. Yet together they reinforced the possibility that the offender invested significant time studying his environment before striking. Another unanswered question centered on transportation. How were the children moved without attracting attention? Investigators knew that abducting a child is only the beginning of the challenge for an offender. Keeping a frightened victim hidden while driving through suburban traffic carries enormous risk. Children cry. They resist. They attempt escape. Unless they are somehow persuaded not to. This possibility introduced several competing theories. Perhaps the offender displayed authority convincing enough to maintain temporary cooperation. Perhaps he restrained victims immediately after entering the vehicle. Or perhaps the children were rendered incapable of resisting. The available evidence never established a definitive answer. Medical findings from the time could not conclusively determine every aspect of the victim's captivity. Some questions remain beyond recovery simply because the necessary evidence no longer exists. That reality frustrates every cold case investigator. There are mysteries science cannot solve because history has already erased the clues. Still, detectives searched for indirect answers. One possibility involved occupations providing privacy. A repair van. A delivery vehicle. A service truck. Such vehicles rarely attract attention in suburban neighborhoods. Children may willingly approach them. Neighbors seldom question their presence. Investigators compared employment records of numerous individuals fitting those categories. Again, possibilities emerged. Again, certainty refused to appear. As public fascination with the case grew over the decades, another challenge surfaced. False confessions. It is one of the strangest phenomena in criminal investigations. High-profile unsolved murders often attract individuals claiming responsibility despite having committed no crime at all. Some seek attention. Others suffer severe mental illness. A few genuinely convinced themselves they were involved. The Oakland County investigation experienced all three. Detectives received letters, telephone calls, personal visits. Some confessions collapsed within minutes because the individual could not describe basic facts known only to investigators. Others appeared more convincing until independent evidence disproved them. Each required time. Each consumed resources. Each diverted attention from legitimate investigative work. Retired detectives later admitted that false leads became one of the investigation's greatest burdens. Because no confession can simply be ignored. If dismissed too quickly, the real offender might slip away. If pursued too aggressively, months disappear chasing fantasy. Finding the balance requires experience and patience. Another subject generated constant debate among investigators. Could there have been more than one offender? The theory emerged for understandable reasons. Holding children captive for several days appears logistically difficult for a lone individual. Maintaining employment. Avoiding suspicion. Providing food. Controlling victims. Managing every aspect alone would require exceptional planning. Some investigators therefore explored whether an accomplice existed. Perhaps someone provided a location. Perhaps another individual assisted in transportation. Perhaps the murders involved a small network rather than a single predator. Despite years of examination, no publicly confirmed evidence established such a conspiracy. The possibility remained part of investigative discussion, but not an established conclusion. Law enforcement consistently emphasized that speculation should never replace evidence. That principle became increasingly important as documentaries and books introduced new audiences to the case. The public often encountered dramatic theories presented with confidence. Detectives encountered something different. Evidence with limitations. Witnesses contradicting one another. Records containing gaps. History rarely unfolds as neatly as television. Real investigations are messy. They advance, retreat, and sometimes stand still for years. The Oakland County child killer case embodied that reality. Then came a breakthrough not in biology, but in information management. Thousands of archived documents were digitally indexed. Investigators could search names, addresses, vehicles, and timelines almost instantly. Connections hidden for decades became easier to identify. One witness statement might mention a license plate. Another, filed years later, might reference the same neighborhood. A third could identify an individual working nearby. No single report solved the mystery. Together, they allowed investigators to revisit the case with unprecedented clarity. Digital mapping added another layer. Crime scenes. Abduction sites. Body recovery locations. Suspect residences. Employment addresses. Travel routes. Everything appeared on interactive maps impossible to create during the original investigation. Analysts searched for overlapping patterns. Certain geographic relationships became clearer. The offender demonstrated familiarity with multiple communities spread across Oakland County. He appeared comfortable navigating both commercial areas and isolated rural roads. That combination suggested someone whose daily life naturally involved travel throughout the region. Again, the profile narrowed possibilities without identifying a specific individual. Then investigators considered something rarely discussed publicly during the early years. Risk. Every offender calculates it differently. The Oakland County child killer repeatedly accepted extraordinary risk during the abductions. Daylight. Public locations. Children expected home within minutes. Yet after the kidnappings, his behavior became remarkably cautious. Bodies were left only after delays. Evidence appeared intentionally minimized. That contrast suggested someone confident during initial contact but deeply concerned about forensic discovery afterward. In other words, he feared being identified. Why? Perhaps because he knew victims could recognize him. Perhaps because he occupied a respected position in the community. Perhaps because arrest would expose a carefully constructed public life. Behavioral experts believed organized offenders often possess much more to lose than disorganized ones. They protect reputations, careers, families, appearances. Everything depends upon remaining ordinary. The killer may have understood that better than anyone. As the years passed, some original investigators publicly acknowledged one painful truth. Despite decades of work, they could not say with confidence that every critical witness had been identified. Some people undoubtedly saw something. Someone may have noticed an unfamiliar conversation, a strange vehicle, an unusual visitor. Yet ordinary observations rarely seem important until tragedy occurs. By then, memory has already begun to fade. That is why cold cases sometimes hinge upon seemingly insignificant recollections resurfacing decades later. A conversation between neighbors. A forgotten newspaper clipping. An old family photograph capturing the background of a parking lot. History occasionally preserves evidence by accident. Investigators never stopped hoping for such a moment. At the same time, laboratories continued extracting every possible answer from preserved forensic material. The unknown DNA profile remained one of the investigation's most valuable assets. Scientists believed future advances might recover even more genetic information than current methods allowed. What seemed impossible in 2020 could become routine in 2030. Cold case detectives have learned never to underestimate science. Many of today's greatest forensic achievements would have sounded like science fiction to investigators working in 1977. The Oakland County child killer had survived every traditional investigative method. But every passing year shifted the balance. Human memory weakened. Technology strengthened. The evidence was no longer aging alone. Science was catching up. And somewhere, whether alive or long deceased, the individual responsible for one of Michigan's darkest mysteries remained connected to the crime by something impossible to outrun. Not rumor. Not suspicion. Not fading witness testimony. But a genetic fingerprint that had waited nearly half a century for the world to learn how to read it. The most haunting aspect of a cold case is not only the unanswered question of who committed the crime. It is the possibility that the answer has been sitting nearby all along. Hidden inside old records. Buried beneath forgotten memories. Waiting inside evidence collected by investigators who never had the tools to unlock its secrets. For the Oakland County child killer investigation, that possibility became more powerful with every passing year. Because unlike many cold cases where evidence disappears completely, this case still contains something extraordinary. A connection to the person responsible. A microscopic biological trace. A silent witness that had survived every failure, every false lead, and every decade of uncertainty. But before DNA could become the key to the mystery, investigators first had to understand the enormous challenge of identifying a killer who had successfully avoided detection for generations. The problem was not simply finding a suspect. The problem was finding the right suspect among thousands. Over the years, countless names entered the investigation. Some were serious possibilities. Others were quickly eliminated. Some remained controversial because public suspicion lasted longer than evidence. The Oakland County child killer case became a place where facts and theories constantly collided. For investigators, separating the two became one of the greatest challenges. A name appearing in a police file did not mean guilt. A suspicious background did not prove involvement. A strange coincidence did not equal evidence. Every suspect required the same standard: proof. And proof had remained painfully absent. One of the reasons the case endured was the offender's ability to avoid leaving a traditional trail. There was no murder weapon recovered. No confession supported by independent evidence. No surviving eyewitness who could identify the killer with certainty. No obvious pattern connecting the offender to a known criminal history. The killer existed almost entirely through the evidence he left behind. And the evidence was incomplete. That reality forced investigators to examine the psychological side of the crimes. Who was capable of committing such acts and disappearing afterward? Criminal profilers often study not only what offenders do, but what they choose not to do. The Oakland County offender did not appear motivated by immediate chaos. He did not attack randomly. He did not leave bodies where they would guarantee immediate discovery. He appeared to understand consequences. That suggested someone who thought ahead. Someone who anticipated police reactions. Someone who understood that the smallest mistake could expose him. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. The killer may have followed the investigation closely. He may have known what police discovered. He may have adjusted his behavior based on what he learned from newspapers and television reports. The 1970s were an era when major investigations unfolded publicly. Press conferences broadcast investigators' theories. Newspapers published details. Television reporters followed every development. For a careful offender, the media itself could become an information source. Every public statement from police revealed what they knew. And what they did not know. That possibility concerned detectives. Because if the killer was watching, every investigative update gave him an advantage. One of the most debated issues involved whether the offender had prior knowledge of police procedures. The way evidence appeared to have been handled suggested awareness of forensic risks. Yet investigators cautioned against assuming the killer possessed specialized training. A person did not need to be a forensic expert to understand that leaving evidence behind was dangerous. Many ordinary people learned basic investigative concepts through television, newspapers, and popular culture. The offender could simply have been cautious. Or he could have had a background providing unusual knowledge. Both possibilities remained open. As the decades passed, investigators began looking more closely at another category of evidence: digital genealogy. The science had transformed how authorities approached unidentified DNA. Traditional DNA searches required an exact match. The unknown profile had to already exist inside a law enforcement database. If the offender had never been arrested or convicted, that search would fail. But genetic genealogy changed the equation. Instead of asking, "Is this person already in the database?" investigators could ask, "Who are this person's relatives?" That question opened an entirely new investigative universe. Human beings carry genetic connections across generations. Parents, siblings, cousins, distant relatives. A person who never provided DNA could become identifiable through a relative who voluntarily submitted genetic information for ancestry research. For cold cases, this was revolutionary. A killer who avoided traditional databases for decades could suddenly become visible through family connections. However, the process required careful interpretation. Genetic genealogy did not simply reveal a name. It created a family tree. Investigators then worked backward and forward through generations, eliminating individuals based on age, location, opportunity, and other evidence. It was slow, detailed, extremely demanding. But it had solved cases once considered impossible. The Oakland County case represented exactly the type of mystery where this approach could potentially succeed. A decades-old crime. An unknown male DNA profile. A limited suspect pool. A community still searching for answers. Yet there was another obstacle. The condition of the DNA itself. Modern forensic laboratories are capable of extraordinary discoveries, but old evidence presents unique challenges. DNA breaks down over time. Environmental conditions affect samples. Previous testing may consume portions of the material. Contamination risks must be carefully considered. Scientists could not simply place a 50-year-old sample into a machine and expect a perfect answer. Every fragment required interpretation. Every result required validation. The process demanded patience. And patience had become something investigators associated with this case more than anything else. The families had waited. Detectives had waited. The community had waited. Now science itself had to wait. While forensic work continued, investigators revisited the lives of the victims. Not only the circumstances of their deaths. Their lives before tragedy. Because understanding the victims was essential to understanding the offender. Mark Stebbins. A 10-year-old boy remembered by family and friends as energetic and outgoing. Timothy King. A 12-year-old who enjoyed sports and spending time outdoors. Jill Robinson. A child whose disappearance shocked an entire community. Christine Mihalik. A young girl whose name became permanently connected to a case that changed Michigan forever. They were not simply case numbers. They were children with personalities, families, and futures. Investigators often emphasize this because decades of criminal analysis can unintentionally transform victims into evidence. But every photograph represented a real person. Every report described a real family. Every unanswered question represented a real wound. That human element kept pressure alive. It prevented the investigation from becoming just another forgotten file. As new detectives took responsibility for the case, they inherited not only evidence but a promise. The victims would not be forgotten. The families would not be abandoned. The search would continue regardless of how much time passed. That commitment became especially important as public attention shifted elsewhere. The 1980s brought new crimes. The 1990s introduced new fears. The 2000s transformed how people consumed information. Every generation had its own headlines. Yet the Oakland County murders remained frozen in Michigan's collective memory. Certain dates remained impossible to ignore. Certain locations carried permanent associations. Certain names still produced immediate recognition. A cold case can become part of a community's identity. This one had. And every anniversary renewed the same question. Who was responsible? The investigation also faced another painful reality. Some potential suspects from the original years were now gone. They had died naturally. Passed away before investigators could compare DNA. Taken secrets with them. That meant time was both an enemy and an ally. Every year reduced the number of living witnesses. But every year improved forensic capabilities. The race between memory and science continued. Investigators began examining whether old evidence could answer questions beyond identity. Could DNA reveal familial relationships? Could it connect the offender to other crimes? Could it confirm or eliminate suspects once considered impossible to evaluate? The possibilities expanded. The technology evolved. The case moved from a 20th century investigation into a 21st century forensic puzzle. Yet one mystery remained at the center. Where was the killer? If the DNA belonged to him, was he still alive? Would he ever face justice? Or had he lived an entire lifetime carrying a secret nobody discovered? Those questions haunted investigators. Many serial offenders eventually reveal themselves through later mistakes. A traffic stop. A domestic dispute. An unrelated arrest. A confession near the end of life. But the Oakland County offender had reached an extraordinary point. Nearly 50 years had passed. If he was alive, he had spent almost his entire adult life avoiding accountability. If he was dead, the truth remained buried with him. Either possibility carried a different kind of tragedy. Justice delayed. Or justice impossible. Still, investigators continued. Because cold cases are rarely solved by giving up. They are solved because someone refuses to stop looking. A retired detective remembers one forgotten detail. A laboratory discovers a new method. A witness finally speaks. A family member submits DNA. A database produces a connection. A single moment changes everything. That was the power of the sample hidden in the Oakland County evidence files. It represented the possibility that the killer's greatest mistake was not leaving evidence behind. It was believing that evidence would remain silent forever. For decades, the offender had relied on time. He assumed memories would fade. Records would disappear. Investigators would retire. The world would move on. But time had created something unexpected. A generation of scientists capable of reading the smallest traces of human existence. And as investigators moved deeper into the genetic evidence, they were no longer searching blindly through a sea of suspects. They were following a biological path. A path that began with 4 children whose lives were stolen. A path that crossed 50 years of unanswered questions. And a path that could finally lead to the person who had remained hidden in the shadows of Michigan history for far too long. For decades, the Oakland County child killer investigation existed in a painful space between hope and despair. The case was never truly forgotten. But it was never solved. It lived in the memories of families who lost children, in the files of detectives who retired without answers, and in the quiet frustration of investigators who inherited a mystery older than some members of their own teams. Then science began changing the rules. The killer had escaped the technology of the 1970s. He had escaped the limitations of eyewitness testimony. He had escaped the mistakes and dead ends that followed the investigation for generations. But he could not escape biology. Because every human being leaves behind traces. Invisible traces. Microscopic pieces of themselves that remain long after memories disappear. And somewhere inside the evidence collected from the victims, investigators believed there was still a connection to the person responsible. The question was whether that connection was strong enough to finally break the case open. The renewed focus on DNA changed the entire atmosphere surrounding the investigation. For years, detectives had worked through possibilities. Now they had something objective. A scientific starting point. But with that discovery came another challenge. How do you identify someone who disappeared into ordinary life nearly 50 years earlier? A person who may never have been arrested. A person who may never have entered any criminal database. A person who could have lived quietly while an entire state searched for him. The answer required investigators to think differently. Traditional police work searches outward. A suspect. A location. A connection. Investigative genetic genealogy searches backward through ancestry. It starts with biology. Then builds a map. A genetic profile can reveal relationships between people who have never met. A distant cousin. A shared ancestor. A branch of a family tree. Piece by piece, investigators can narrow possibilities. The process is not simple. It is not a magical search engine producing an instant name. It requires genealogy experts, forensic scientists, detectives, and historians working together. Every potential family connection must be researched. Birth records. Marriage records. Death certificates. Census information. Geographic history. Employment records. Everything matters. A person may share DNA with a relative connected to the offender but have no criminal involvement whatsoever. That is why the process demands extraordinary caution. Investigators cannot accuse someone simply because science points in their direction. The evidence must support the conclusion. For the Oakland County case, this approach offered something the investigation had lacked for decades. A way to move from thousands of possibilities toward a smaller, more realistic group. The search was no longer based only on behavior. It was based on inheritance. A biological trail passed through generations. The same DNA that connects families could also expose secrets. That possibility carried enormous emotional weight. Because somewhere in America, someone might unknowingly carry the key to one of Michigan's darkest mysteries. A person who had no idea that their family history was connected to a decades-old crime. A relative who had never heard the name Oakland County child killer. A branch of a family tree hiding an answer nobody expected. As investigators explored modern forensic options, they also continued examining old suspects. The passage of time had changed the landscape. Some individuals once considered serious possibilities were now deceased. Others had disappeared from public attention. Some had left behind DNA samples through unrelated investigations. Others had families who could provide comparisons. Every name had to be reconsidered. Not through rumors. Through evidence. This process also forced investigators to confront uncomfortable questions about past theories. For decades, certain suspects became almost legendary among people following the case. Their names appeared repeatedly in books, documentaries, and online discussions. Some were associated with troubling behavior. Some had suspicious histories. Some seemed to match portions of the offender profile. But investigators knew a dangerous truth. A person can appear suspicious and still be innocent. The human mind naturally searches for patterns. Especially when confronted with terrible crimes. People want an answer. They want a face. They want someone to blame. But justice requires something more. It requires proof. That principle remained central as DNA technology entered the investigation. Science could eliminate. Science could confirm. Science could challenge decades of assumptions. And that possibility made every future comparison important. One of the most difficult aspects of the case involved the possibility that the killer had lived a completely ordinary life after the murders. This possibility disturbed investigators because history had shown that many offenders successfully hide in plain sight. They become fathers, neighbors, employees, friends. They attend social gatherings. They create memories unrelated to their crimes. Their public identity becomes a shield. The person others know and the person responsible for violence can exist side by side. That contradiction is one of the most disturbing realities in criminal investigations. A monster does not always look like a monster. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a community is the one nobody suspects. If the Oakland County offender followed that pattern, then someone may have spent decades remembering him as a normal person. A helpful neighbor. A friendly coworker. A quiet family member. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching for the truth behind a crime that had defined an era. Another challenge emerged. The passage of time had transformed witnesses. Children who remembered events in the 1970s were now elderly. Their memories had aged. Some details remained vivid. Others became uncertain. A witness might remember a face but not a date. A vehicle but not a license plate. A conversation but not exact words. Investigators understood these limitations. Memory is not a recording. It changes. It adapts. It fills gaps. That does not mean witnesses are dishonest. It means human recollection is complicated. Modern detectives approached historical testimony carefully. They looked for consistency across multiple sources. One person remembering a detail could be unreliable. Several independent people recalling the same unusual event could become significant. The challenge was separating meaningful information from decades of accumulated noise. Because the Oakland County file contained both. Thousands of pages. Thousands of voices. Some pointing toward truth. Others toward distraction. Another important development came from advances in forensic interpretation. Modern laboratories learned that DNA evidence is not simply about finding a match. The amount of DNA. The quality of the sample. The location where it was discovered. The circumstances surrounding collection. All influence how scientists interpret results. A DNA profile can be powerful, but its meaning depends on context. Investigators understood that the public often expected a simple answer. DNA equals solved. Reality was more complicated. DNA could provide a direction. It could identify a person. But detectives still needed to prove how that person connected to the crime. A genetic match alone would not explain motive. It would not reconstruct every missing moment. It would not answer every question families had carried for decades. It would be the beginning, not the end. That reality became especially important because of the age of the case. Nearly 50 years separated investigators from the original crimes. A suspect identified today would have to be connected not only biologically but historically. Could he have been in Oakland County during the murders? Was he the correct age? Did his life circumstances provide opportunity? Did his movements align with the timeline? Every detail would matter. The investigation had entered a new era. The old methods had produced possibilities. The new methods could produce answers. But between possibility and proof stood an enormous amount of work. Behind the scenes, investigators continued reviewing evidence with renewed determination. Boxes once considered historical artifacts became active investigative material again. Photographs were digitized. Documents analyzed. Evidence inventories updated. Every item received another look. Because cold cases often break through overlooked details. Not always dramatic discoveries. Sometimes something small. A name written in the corner of a report. A forgotten address. A connection nobody noticed because the technology did not exist to reveal it. The Oakland County case had survived because every generation contributed something new. The original detectives collected evidence. Later investigators preserved it. Scientists developed methods to analyze it. Researchers created tools to connect information. The case was no longer limited to one era. It had become a collaboration across decades. And perhaps that was the reason it remained alive. Because while the killer had depended on time to protect him, time had also created the possibility of his downfall. Every year produced better science. Every year produced new ways to search. Every year made the impossible slightly less impossible. The families of the victims understood that progress could be slow. They had learned not to measure hope in days or weeks. They measured it in years. Sometimes decades. But hope remained. Because somewhere behind the mystery was a simple truth. The victims deserved answers. Their families deserved justice. And the person responsible deserved to face the consequences of what happened. The DNA sample represented more than a forensic breakthrough. It represented a confrontation between past and present. A crime committed in an era when evidence could disappear. A solution emerging in an era when evidence could speak. For nearly 50 years, the Oakland County child killer had relied on one advantage above all others. Silence. But silence was beginning to disappear. The evidence was no longer trapped in the past. The technology of the future had reached back through time. And for the first time in generations, investigators were no longer asking whether the case could be solved. They were asking a far more dangerous question. If the DNA could reveal the truth, who would the truth lead them to? For nearly 5 decades, the Oakland County child killer investigation had been defined by one painful reality. Everyone knew what happened. Almost no one knew why. For children were taken from ordinary places. For families were destroyed. For communities were changed forever. Yet the person responsible remained hidden behind a wall of uncertainty. But by the time modern forensic science entered the picture, investigators were no longer chasing only memories. They were chasing a biological connection. A fragment of evidence that had survived longer than many of the people who first searched for the killer. The DNA did not speak in words. It did not reveal motive. It did not explain the terrible decisions made in those final moments of the victims' lives. But it offered something the investigation had never possessed before. A direct path toward identity. And that possibility changed everything. The world of criminal investigation had transformed dramatically since the Oakland County murders began. In 1976, detectives depended heavily on human observation. A witness remembering a face. A neighbor noticing a vehicle. A store employee recalling a conversation. Today, investigators operate in an environment where information can be preserved, compared, and analyzed on a scale unimaginable to the original detectives. The past and present had finally collided. But solving a cold case is not simply a matter of discovering new technology. It requires rebuilding history. Investigators had to reconstruct a world that no longer existed. Oakland County in the 1970s was different. Businesses had changed names. Roads had been redesigned. Buildings demolished. Neighborhoods transformed. People moved. Families separated. Witnesses aged. The physical landscape itself had become another layer of the mystery. Detectives returned to old maps. They studied the locations where the children disappeared. They examined the places where their bodies were recovered. They looked for connections that earlier generations could not see. Distance, travel time, visibility, accessibility. Every detail mattered. The goal was not simply to understand where crimes occurred. It was to understand how the offender operated. Because location reveals behavior. A criminal who chooses certain places repeatedly often exposes something about himself. Comfort, familiarity, routine. The Oakland County offender appeared comfortable navigating suburban Michigan. The disappearances occurred in populated communities. Yet the victims were moved without drawing immediate attention. That suggested confidence. The killer understood his environment. He understood when and where children would be vulnerable. He understood how ordinary life created opportunities. This was one of the reasons investigators believed the offender likely lived within or near the region. Not because outsiders are incapable of committing local crimes, but because familiarity reduces risk. The person who knows the streets does not need a map. The person who understands the community knows where people look and where they do not. As the investigation continued into the modern era, detectives also revisited the psychological profile of the offender. For decades, experts had debated one central question. Was the killer organized or disorganized? The evidence strongly suggested organization. The offender appeared to plan. He controlled situations. He avoided leaving obvious traces. He maintained enough discipline to commit multiple crimes without immediate capture. Organized offenders are often described as individuals who can blend into society. They may understand social expectations. They may manipulate trust. They may appear calm under pressure. That description created an unsettling possibility. The person responsible may not have looked dangerous. He may have looked ordinary. Perhaps that was his greatest advantage. A frightening stranger attracts attention. An ordinary person disappears into the background. Investigators examined old reports through this perspective. Who had access to children without appearing suspicious? Who had a reason to be present in suburban neighborhoods? Who could approach families and children without immediate concern? The list remained enormous. But the questions became sharper. Another challenge involved the passage of time. A suspect who was a young adult in 1976 would now be elderly. A suspect who was middle-aged would likely have passed away. Age changed the investigation. Some individuals could no longer be interviewed. Some could no longer provide DNA samples voluntarily. Some had left behind only memories. Yet investigators recognized something important. Death does not always end an investigation. Sometimes it creates new opportunities. A deceased suspect may leave behind biological relatives, family records, archived documents, stored belongings. In some cases, the truth can emerge after the person responsible is gone. The purpose of solving a cold case is not only punishment. It is truth. Families deserve to know what happened. Communities deserve to understand what they endured. Victims deserve recognition beyond the circumstances of their deaths. That became one of the strongest motivations behind the continued Oakland County investigation. The victims' names remained at the center. Not the killer. Not the theories. Not the speculation. The children. Every new technology was valuable because it served one purpose: finding answers for them. As DNA analysis advanced, investigators carefully considered genetic genealogy. The technique had already changed criminal investigations across America. Cases that had remained unsolved for decades suddenly produced names. Unknown offenders were identified through distant relatives. Victims finally received justice. But every case presented unique challenges. Genetic genealogy requires a usable DNA profile. It requires database connections. It requires careful interpretation. And it requires investigators willing to follow unexpected paths. A family tree can stretch in countless directions. One connection may lead nowhere. Another may unlock everything. For Oakland County detectives, the possibility was both exciting and frustrating. They had a clue. But clues are not answers. A DNA profile without a confirmed identity is like a fingerprint without a name. It tells investigators that someone was there. It does not immediately tell them who. The search therefore continued through multiple avenues. Historical suspects were reviewed. Potential family connections examined. Available records analyzed. Every step brought the investigation closer, but also reminded detectives how difficult the case remained. Because the Oakland County murders were not simply old. They were complex. The killer had created uncertainty from the beginning. And uncertainty was exactly what allowed the case to survive. Another significant issue involved public expectations. Whenever news spread that investigators were using advanced DNA methods, many people assumed an arrest was imminent. But forensic investigations do not move at the speed of headlines. They move at the speed of evidence. A single genetic connection can require months or years of verification. Investigators must be absolutely certain before changing someone's life forever. The consequences are enormous. A mistaken accusation destroys innocent people. A rushed conclusion damages the possibility of true justice. So detectives proceeded carefully. Slowly. Methodically. The same patience that had defined the investigation for decades remained necessary. Meanwhile, the community continued to remember. The Oakland County murders were not just a historical event. They were a scar. Older residents remembered the fear. Parents remembered changing how they raised their children. Former classmates remembered the empty desks. Entire neighborhoods carried memories of a time when childhood innocence disappeared. The phrase, Oakland County Child Killer, became permanently connected to Michigan's history. It represented a moment when suburban America realized danger could exist anywhere. Not only in distant cities. Not only in places considered unsafe. But near homes. Schools. Shopping centers. The places families trusted most. That emotional impact helped maintain public interest long after the original investigation faded from national headlines. People continued asking questions. Could the killer still be alive? Did he confess before death? Did someone close to him know? Was someone protecting him? Theories continued because the central question remained unanswered. Who was he? Investigators understood that curiosity could help. Public attention sometimes produces new witnesses. Someone who ignored a detail decades earlier may finally recognize its importance. Someone who stayed silent may decide the time has come to speak. Cold cases often break because the world changes around them. People age. Relationships end. Secrets become harder to maintain. The passage of time can weaken loyalty. A person who protected someone 50 years earlier may no longer feel the same obligation. That possibility remained another reason detectives never closed the door. Every year brought potential new information. And every year, science improved. The unknown DNA profile represented a direct challenge to the killer's greatest assumption. That enough time would pass. That people would forget. That evidence would become meaningless. But the opposite happened. Time preserved the mystery long enough for technology to catch up. The offender had relied on the limitations of the past. Investigators now had the tools of the future. The question was whether those tools would finally be enough. Because somewhere, hidden within decades of records and generations of family history, was a connection. A name. A person. A life. And if investigators could follow the DNA trail far enough, the mystery that had haunted Michigan since the 1970s might finally have a face. But before that moment could arrive, they would have to confront one of the most difficult challenges in any cold case. Not finding evidence, but proving what that evidence truly meant. For decades, the Oakland County child killer investigation survived because of one impossible contradiction. The evidence suggested the offender had made mistakes. But not enough mistakes. There were traces. But no identity. There were suspects. But no proof. There were theories. But no conclusion. The case existed in a painful middle ground where everyone believed the truth was somewhere within reach, yet every path seemed to disappear into darkness. Then modern forensic science changed the nature of the search. The investigation was no longer limited to what people remembered. It could now examine what the killer himself had left behind. DNA had become the silent witness that never forgot. But even the most powerful evidence requires a story. A connection. A reason. And investigators knew that identifying a genetic profile was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The real challenge was proving that the person connected to the DNA was the same person who had committed one of Michigan's most devastating crimes. That required rebuilding the past. Not through assumptions. Through facts. Every cold case has a timeline. Every timeline has gaps. And in Oakland County, those gaps stretched across generations. The first disappearance. The searches. The discoveries. The investigations. The suspects. The failures. The unanswered questions. All of it had to be reconstructed with modern eyes. Investigators returned to the original case files, many of which contain details recorded by detectives who were no longer alive. Handwritten notes. Interview summaries. Crime scene observations. Evidence inventories. The documents represented thousands of hours of human effort. But they also represented the limitations of another era. Investigators in the 1970s could not search databases instantly. They could not digitally compare records from different jurisdictions. They could not use genetic genealogy. They worked with what they had. And what they had was determination. The renewed investigation required respecting that history while also acknowledging its weaknesses. Some leads were based on incomplete information. Some witness statements changed over time. Some investigative paths were explored because they seemed logical then, even if they appeared less important today. Cold cases require humility. The goal is not to prove previous detectives wrong. The goal is to find the truth they were searching for. As investigators analyzed the surviving evidence, one fact became increasingly significant. The offender had managed to maintain control over 4 separate crimes. That pattern suggested confidence. Not luck. Luck can explain one escape. Maybe even two. But repeated success requires something else. Planning. Adaptability. Awareness. The killer understood enough about his environment and victims to avoid capture. That understanding became central to modern profiling. Investigators asked, what kind of person could do this? Not just physically. Psychologically. Who could live with such actions? Who could return home afterward? Who could interact with neighbors while carrying a secret that horrific? Those questions often reveal more than the crime scenes themselves. Because offenders are shaped by their choices. The Oakland County killer chose patience. He chose concealment. He chose control. And those choices created a behavioral signature. One of the strongest theories among investigators was that the offender had some ability to appear trustworthy. This did not necessarily mean he was charming or charismatic. Sometimes trust comes from simple familiarity. A face people recognize. A person who belongs. A person who does not immediately trigger fear. That possibility made the investigation even more disturbing. Because it suggested the killer may not have hidden in the shadows. He may have stood in plain sight. The community had searched for a monster. But monsters do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they look ordinary. That realization changed how investigators examined old witness accounts. A person once described as friendly could now appear differently when viewed through the lens of a criminal investigation. A person who seemed merely unusual might deserve another look. But detectives faced a difficult balance. Suspicion alone could destroy innocent lives. Every individual had to be evaluated against evidence. Not emotions. Not public pressure. Not rumors. That standard became especially important as online communities continued discussing the case. The internet created a new environment where amateur investigators could examine information from around the world. Some discoveries proved useful. Others created confusion. Unverified claims spread quickly. Old rumors gained new life. Names became attached to theories without supporting evidence. Law enforcement repeatedly emphasized the difference between investigation and speculation. A theory is not a fact. A possibility is not proof. A suspicion is not guilt. Those principles mattered more than ever. Because after 50 years, the number of possible stories surrounding the case had become enormous. The truth, however, remained singular. Only one explanation would fit all the evidence. The DNA evidence represented the strongest path toward that explanation. But even DNA required careful interpretation. Forensic scientists examined how biological material could have been transferred. Direct contact. Indirect contact. Environmental exposure. Earlier handling. Each possibility had to be considered. A careless interpretation could lead investigators in the wrong direction. A careful interpretation could solve a mystery that had survived generations. That was the responsibility placed upon modern forensic teams. They were not simply analyzing a sample. They were handling the hopes of families who had waited decades. The weight of that responsibility was enormous. The investigation also faced another obstacle. The passage of time had changed potential suspects. In 1976, many individuals could have been questioned directly. By the modern era, some were elderly. Some were deceased. Some had moved away. Some had left behind limited records. The search had become a race against history itself. Every year removed another possible witness. Every year improved another scientific method. The investigators were chasing an answer through a narrowing window. Yet history had shown that time does not always protect criminals. Sometimes time exposes them. People who hide secrets for decades often become vulnerable later in life. Relationships change. Families discover hidden information. Old documents surface. Someone decides silence has lasted long enough. Cold cases are often solved not because the evidence suddenly appears, but because someone finally decides to reveal what they know. The Oakland County investigation remained open to that possibility. Every new piece of information mattered. Every forgotten memory mattered. Every genetic connection mattered. The case was no longer a frozen moment from the 1970s. It had become a living investigation moving through modern technology. And one of the most important developments was the growing ability to connect unknown DNA profiles with family histories. Genetic genealogy transformed the relationship between investigators and evidence. Previously, DNA answered a narrow question. Who is this person? Now it could answer a broader one. Who is this person's family? That difference changed everything. A criminal who never entered a police database could still be connected through relatives. A person who avoided arrest for decades could still leave a genetic trail through generations. The very thing that makes DNA powerful in families, the fact that it connects people, became the same mechanism that could expose hidden identities. For the Oakland County killer, that possibility represented a threat unlike anything he had faced before. He had escaped detectives. He had escaped traditional forensic methods. He had escaped the limitations of his era. But he could not escape inheritance. Every person carries history inside them. Sometimes that history reveals itself when no one expects it. As investigators followed the possibilities created by modern genetics, they also returned to the victim's final known moments. Not because they wanted to revisit tragedy. Because every detail mattered. The last confirmed sightings. The locations. The timing. The movements. The decisions made by ordinary people on ordinary days. The children did not disappear from a world of chaos. They disappeared from routines. A bike ride. A short walk. A trip to a store. Moments that should have been forgotten by evening. Instead, they became permanent chapters in Michigan history. That reality continued motivating investigators. The purpose was not simply to identify a killer. It was to restore something stolen decades earlier. Truth. Families wanted to know what happened. They wanted answers to questions that had followed them for half a century. Where were their children taken? Why them? Who was responsible? Would the person ever admit what he did? Some answers might never come. Even an identification would not erase the pain. But knowing the truth matters. Uncertainty creates a different kind of suffering. It leaves families trapped between hope and grief. A solved case does not undo the past. But it allows people to finally stop searching. That possibility was what kept the Oakland County investigation alive. The DNA sample represented more than science. It represented the possibility that the final unanswered chapter of the case had finally begun to open. For nearly 50 years, investigators had chased a shadow. Now they had a trail. The trail was fragile. Complicated. Incomplete. But it existed. And for the first time in decades, the question surrounding the Oakland County child killer was no longer only, will we ever know? It had changed. Now investigators were asking something far more dangerous for the person responsible. What if we already have the answer and we just haven't found the name yet? For nearly 50 years, the Oakland County child killer investigation existed as one of the most painful examples of justice delayed. Not forgotten. Not abandoned. But unfinished. The families had carried unanswered questions through entire lifetimes. Detectives had retired with boxes of files still sitting on their desks. New investigators inherited a case older than many of the people assigned to solve it. But the arrival of advanced DNA technology changed something fundamental. For the first time, the killer was no longer only a name on a missing page. He was connected to a biological trace. A fragment of identity. A piece of the person who had remained hidden for generations. The question was whether investigators could turn that fragment into a name. And whether that name could finally explain what happened in Oakland County during those terrifying months of 1976 and 1977. Cold case investigations often reach a moment where science and history collide. Science provides possibilities. History provides context. Neither can succeed alone. The DNA profile represented the scientific side of the equation. The decades of investigation represented the historical side. To solve the case, both had to come together. Investigators began examining every possible connection surrounding the genetic evidence. The process was slow and deliberate. A DNA profile could generate leads, but leads required verification. Potential relatives had to be identified. Family trees had to be reconstructed. Geographic connections had to be examined. The timeline had to match. The person connected to the DNA had to have the opportunity, age, and circumstances necessary to be involved. A genetic relationship alone was not enough. Investigators understood that the greatest danger in a case this old was becoming emotionally attached to a theory. After decades without answers, any possible solution could become tempting. But evidence does not exist to confirm what people hope is true. Evidence exists to reveal what is true. That discipline became essential. Because the Oakland County case had already experienced decades of theories. Some were built on real concerns. Others were created by fear. Some suspects attracted attention because their behavior seemed suspicious. Others because their names became connected to rumors. But rumors cannot convict. Only facts can. As investigators continued analyzing the case, they also studied the changing landscape of criminal behavior. The person responsible in the 1970s would have lived through enormous social changes. The rise of computers. The growth of forensic databases. The expansion of surveillance technology. The Internet. The world that had allowed him to disappear no longer existed. A person who once believed anonymity was permanent now lived in an era where the smallest biological trace could become a roadmap. The killer's greatest advantage had been time. But time had also created his greatest threat. Technology. Every year brought better methods. Every year brought more data. Every year reduced the number of places where secrets could remain hidden. The investigation also benefited from a new generation of detectives who had no emotional connection to old theories. They did not inherit personal loyalties. They did not inherit assumptions. They inherited evidence. That perspective allowed them to reconsider questions that had been debated for decades. Were investigators looking for the wrong type of offender? Had they focused too heavily on certain suspects? Had important information been overlooked because it did not fit earlier beliefs? Cold cases often require investigators to challenge their own history. Not because previous detectives lacked ability, but because every era sees crimes differently. The original investigators worked without modern genetics. The next generation worked with emerging forensic technology. The current generation could combine both. That combination created new possibilities. One of the most important lessons from other cold cases was that answers often emerge from unexpected places. A suspect who was never considered. A relative who never knew. A document stored away for decades. A forgotten conversation. A small detail that only becomes meaningful when connected with other information. The Oakland County investigation contained thousands of such details. The challenge was identifying which ones mattered. Among the most valuable resources were surviving investigators who had worked the original case. Their memories provided context impossible to obtain from documents alone. They remembered the atmosphere, the pressure, the decisions made during the investigation. They remembered which leads seemed promising, which suspects consumed resources, which questions remained unanswered. Their knowledge represented a bridge between the past and present. But even their memories had limits. Human memory changes. Decades alter details. That is why investigators combined personal recollections with documented evidence. The goal was not to rely on memory alone. It was to use memory as a guide. Another critical area of examination involved the offender's possible post-crime behavior. How does someone live after committing such crimes? Some offenders become increasingly reckless. Others disappear completely. Some experience guilt. Others feel excitement from avoiding capture. Some continue offending. Others stop permanently. The fact that no confirmed similar crimes appeared after the Oakland County murders created another mystery. Why did the killings end? Several explanations remained possible. The offender may have died. He may have been imprisoned for another offense. He may have moved away. He may have deliberately stopped. Or investigators may simply have failed to connect later crimes. Each possibility carried different implications. If the killer continued living normally, he may have carried the secret silently for decades. If he died, the truth might survive only through forensic evidence and those who knew him. If he had committed additional crimes elsewhere, the Oakland County murders could represent only one part of a much larger story. Investigators considered all possibilities. Because cold cases require openness. The truth rarely follows the path people expect. As the investigation continued, the victims remained the center of every decision. Modern discussions about DNA and technology sometimes risk reducing cases to puzzles. But this was never only a puzzle. It was a tragedy. For children whose futures disappeared. For families forced to live with permanent questions. A community whose sense of safety changed forever. The technology mattered because it served the people affected. Not because solving mysteries creates headlines. Justice is about victims. It is about acknowledging what happened. It is about restoring names and stories that were almost overwhelmed by the crimes committed against them. The families had waded through decades of uncertainty. Some relatives who once demanded answers were no longer alive to see the progress. That reality added another layer of urgency. Every year mattered. Every delay mattered. Every breakthrough mattered. The investigation continued moving forward because the passage of time could not be allowed to become another victory for the person responsible. The offender had already taken enough. He had taken lives. He had taken innocence. He had taken decades from families searching for answers. He would not be allowed to take the truth as well. By this stage, the case had become a symbol of something larger. A reminder that unsolved does not mean forgotten. A reminder that evidence does not expire. A reminder that technology can reach backward through time and challenge even the strongest illusions of escape. The Oakland County child killer had survived because he believed the world of 1977 would protect him forever. A world without genetic genealogy. Without massive databases. Without digital archives. Without the ability to connect tiny biological traces to distant family histories. But that world was gone. The past had finally gained the tools of the present. And investigators were following a trail that began with a microscopic sample and extended through generations. The search was no longer about hundreds of rumors. It was no longer about endless speculation. It was about connections. DNA connections. Family connections. Historical connections. Every link brought investigators closer. Yet one final challenge remained. Even if science pointed toward a person, would the evidence be strong enough to reveal the complete truth? Would it explain the missing years? Would it answer the questions that had haunted families for half a century? Would it finally provide justice? Those questions remained. Because solving the identity of an offender is only one part of solving a crime. The deeper mystery is understanding how it happened. How someone could commit such acts. How someone could remain hidden. How a community could live beside a secret for generations. The Oakland County child killer investigation was approaching the most critical stage in its long history. The evidence that had waited silently for decades was finally being heard. The investigation that had stalled for generations was moving again. And somewhere beyond the files, beyond the theories, beyond the unanswered questions, was a person connected to that DNA. A person whose identity could redefine everything investigators believed about the case. For 50 years, the killer had been a shadow. But shadows disappear when light reaches them. And the light was getting closer. For nearly half a century, the name Oakland County child killer represented one of the most painful questions in American criminal history. Who was he? How did he disappear? How did someone commit 4 horrific crimes, leave behind a trail of broken families and unanswered questions, and remain unknown for generations? The mystery survived because the investigation had always been trapped between two realities. The truth existed somewhere. But the evidence needed to reach it had remained just beyond the ability of investigators to understand. Until science changed the rules. The DNA sample recovered from preserved evidence became more than a forensic discovery. It became a symbol of everything the case represented. The passage of time. The persistence of investigators. The hope of families. And the possibility that even the darkest secrets can eventually be uncovered. But the road from DNA to justice was never simple. A genetic profile does not tell a story by itself. It does not reveal the emotions of a victim. It does not explain the decisions of a criminal. It does not erase decades of pain. It provides a direction. A path. A place for investigators to begin searching. And after 50 years of uncertainty, having a path was something investigators had not possessed before. The Oakland County investigation had survived countless obstacles. The limitations of 1970s forensic science. The loss of witnesses. The deaths of investigators and potential suspects. The disappearance of physical locations connected to the crimes. The spread of rumors. The passage of time itself. Yet through all of it, one thing remained unchanged. The commitment to finding the truth. Detectives who worked the original investigation understood they might never see the final answer. Many retired. Some passed away. But the case continued through those who inherited it. Each generation carried the responsibility forward. The files changed hands. The technology changed. The methods changed. The mission did not. The victims remained at the center. Mark Stebbins, Timothy King, Jill Robinson, Christine Mihalik. For children whose names became permanently connected to a mystery they never should have been part of. Their lives were reduced by the crimes committed against them, but they were never defined only by those crimes. They were sons and daughters, friends, classmates, children with futures that should have continued. Every year that passed represented another year stolen from them. And another year their families lived without answers. That is why cold cases matter. They are not only about the past. They are about people still living with the consequences of the past. A solved case cannot undo tragedy. It cannot return lost years. It cannot erase grief. But truth has its own importance. The unknown creates a unique kind of suffering. Families can mourn a death. But uncertainty leaves them trapped between mourning and searching. The Oakland County family spent decades asking questions that had no answers. Where were their children? Who took them? Why? Was the person responsible still alive? Did he ever feel regret? Did anyone around him know? Those questions followed them through birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary moments when memories returned unexpectedly. The investigation continued because those questions deserved answers. Modern forensic technology offered possibilities unimaginable to detectives in the 1970s. The same evidence that once represented a dead end could now represent a beginning. Genetic genealogy transformed the landscape of criminal investigations. Cases considered impossible were reopened. Unknown offenders received identities. Families received long-awaited explanations. The technology did not replace traditional police work. It strengthened it. Science could create a connection. Investigators still had to prove the story behind that connection. They still had to examine opportunity, location, timeline, behavior, relationships. Every piece had to fit. That careful approach was especially important in a case surrounded by decades of speculation. The Oakland County investigation had accumulated theories for generations. Some focused on individuals who attracted public attention. Some focused on possible groups. Some focused on hidden networks. But theories are temporary. Evidence is permanent. The future of the case depended not on the loudest claims, but on the strongest facts. That principle separated investigation from speculation. And it remained the only path toward justice. One of the most haunting possibilities surrounding the case was that the person responsible may have lived an ordinary life after the murders. Perhaps he worked. Perhaps he had relationships. Perhaps people knew him as someone completely different. That possibility has appeared repeatedly in criminal history. The most dangerous secrets are often hidden behind normal appearances. A person can become part of a community while carrying something unimaginable. If that was true in Oakland County, then the killer may have spent decades believing he had escaped forever. But escape and innocence are not the same thing. A crime without an arrest is still a crime. A mystery without an answer is still a mystery. And evidence preserved through time can eventually challenge even the most successful attempts at concealment. The killer's greatest advantage had been the limitations of the past. But those limitations disappeared. The technology that exists today did not exist when the children were murdered. The databases, the genetic analysis, the digital records, the ability to connect information across decades. The investigation became a battle between a crime committed in the 20th century and science developed in the 21st. And science had the advantage of patience. It waited. It improved. It became more powerful. The same biological material that once meant almost nothing could eventually become the key to everything. That possibility carried enormous emotional weight. Because for decades, many people wondered whether the case would ever move again. Cold cases can create a dangerous illusion. The longer they remain unsolved, the easier it becomes to believe they will remain unsolved forever. But history has repeatedly proven otherwise. Time does not always bury evidence. Sometimes time protects it. Sometimes time allows science to catch up. Sometimes the answer arrives from a place nobody expected. A new witness. A forgotten record. A genetic connection. A discovery hidden inside something everyone believed had already been examined. The Oakland County child killer investigation represented all of those possibilities. It was not just a story about a criminal who escaped. It was a story about a community that refused to forget. A story about investigators who continued searching after the headlines disappeared. A story about families who carried pain longer than anyone should have to. And a story about how a tiny piece of evidence could challenge decades of silence. The final chapter of the investigation was not simply about finding a name. It was about understanding what happened. About answering the questions left behind in 1976 and 1977. About giving meaning to evidence collected from children who deserved protection. About ensuring their stories were remembered for more than the tragedy that ended their lives. The Oakland County child killer became one of Michigan's darkest mysteries because the person responsible remained unknown for so long. But mysteries are not permanent. They exist only until the right evidence meets the right technology at the right moment. For nearly 50 years, the killer had hidden behind the passage of time. He had relied on fading memories. Changing landscapes. A world that moved forward. But the past never truly disappeared. It waited. Inside old evidence boxes. Inside forgotten documents. Inside the memories of those who refused to stop searching. And inside a microscopic trace of DNA that carried the one thing the killer could never completely erase. His own identity. The story of the Oakland County child killer remains a reminder of the power of persistence. That justice can move slowly. That answers can arrive decades after questions are first asked. That a case can survive even when hope becomes difficult to maintain. Because somewhere between the first desperate search in 1976 and the advanced forensic investigations of the modern era, one truth remained unchanged. For children deserved justice. Their families deserved answers. And the person responsible, no matter how much time passed, could never completely escape the evidence left behind. The mystery that haunted Michigan for half a century was never truly silent. It was only waiting for someone to learn how to listen.